In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became incredibly popular among young people across America. It was a time defined by a spirit of counterculture, exploration, and a widespread sense of communal trust. Hitchhiking was viewed as a normal, socially acceptable, and highly efficient form of alternative transportation. The mechanics of it were simple and universally understood. A traveler would stand on the side of a busy highway, extend their arm, and hold their thumb upward to signal passing motorists that they needed a ride. If a driver felt inclined to help, they would pull over to the shoulder, the hitchhiker would hop into the vehicle, and they would set off toward a shared destination. Today, the idea of getting into a car with a complete stranger, or conversely, picking up an unknown person from the side of the road, seems unfathomably dangerous. Modern society views the practice with intense skepticism shaped by decades of cautionary tales. But in the late 1970s, it was still considered a routine way for a young person to travel across the vast expanses of the United States. It was with this mindset that 15-year-old Mary Vincent found herself standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, on the 29th of September, 1978. Modesto was a city located in California's Central Valley, not terribly far from the bustling hub of San Francisco. Mary was a rebellious, fiercely independent teenager who had recently run away from her family home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through an incredibly bitter, hostile, and exhausting divorce, and the atmosphere inside her house had become entirely unbearable for her. Desperate to escape the emotional turmoil and constant arguments, Mary decided to leave. She used the universal network of hitchhiking to travel all the way from Las Vegas down to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. However, after spending just a couple of days at her grandfather's home, the reality of her situation began to set in. The initial adrenaline of running away faded, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating wave of homesickness. Despite the chaos of her parents' crumbling marriage, Mary deeply missed her family, her siblings, and the comfort of the familiar. She desperately wanted to return to Las Vegas. One afternoon, while her grandfather was out of the house running errands, Mary decided to act on her feelings. She quietly slipped out of his home, carrying a small bag of personal belongings, and headed toward the highway to begin the long journey back to Nevada. Hitchhiking alone as a teenage girl was difficult and slow, but Mary managed to secure a series of rides that brought her northward from Los Angeles up to Modesto. The drivers who had helped her so far were ordinary, decent people who simply wanted to assist a traveling teenager. By the time she reached Modesto, she was positioned on a stretch of highway looking for another vehicle that could take her farther south and east back toward Las Vegas. On this particular afternoon, Mary was not entirely alone. She had grouped up with two other young hitchhikers who were also trying to travel down the coast. Together, the three teenagers stood in a small huddle on the shoulder of the road. To make their intentions completely clear to passing motorists, they were holding up cardboard signs that boldly read, "Going South." They hoped that traveling as a group would make them look safer and perhaps encourage a driver with a larger vehicle to pick them all up. In the middle of the afternoon, a light blue passenger van slowed down as it approached the trio. The van belonged to a man who appeared to be in his 50s. He looked completely ordinary, harmless, and unthreatening, the kind of older man who easily blended into a crowd. Seeing their signs, the driver pulled the van over to the side of the highway, parking about 15 feet ahead of where the teenagers were standing. Mary's two companions stayed back, waiting to see what the driver would say, while Mary eagerly ran forward to initiate the conversation. She walked up to the passenger side of the van, where the window had already been rolled down. Looking inside, she saw that the driver was alone, and the back of the van was completely wide open, offering plenty of space. Mary politely addressed the man, asking if he would be willing to give all three of them a ride, since they were all heading south. The man looked directly at Mary and shook his head. He replied in a calm but firm voice, stating that he could only give her a ride and that he would not accommodate the other two teenagers. Mary felt an immediate wave of confusion and hesitation. She looked past him into the interior of the light blue van, noting the abundance of empty space. There were no large boxes, no extra passengers, and no obvious reasons why three teenagers couldn't easily fit inside. She gently prodded the man, asking him if he was absolutely sure he couldn't take her friends along, emphasizing that they were all traveling to the exact same area. The man did not offer a complex explanation. He simply repeated himself with chilling finality, making it clear that he would take her, but he absolutely would not take the others. Sensing that this was her only immediate option, Mary told the driver to wait for a moment while she retrieved her bag. She walked back to her two companions and explained the driver's strict condition. Her friends instantly grew alarmed. They told Mary that something felt incredibly wrong about the situation. They pointed out that a normal, well-meaning driver with an empty van would have no logical reason to refuse two extra passengers who were heading in the exact same direction. They explicitly warned her not to get into the vehicle, sensing an unspoken danger. Mary harbored her own internal reservations. A small, quiet voice in her mind told her that her friends were right. But her intense desire to get home completely clouded her judgment. She was so deeply homesick, so physically exhausted from days of traveling, and so desperate to see her parents that she could not bear the thought of waiting on the highway shoulder for another night. She knew that not every driver was willing to pick up hitchhikers, and she feared that if she turned this ride down, she might be stuck in Modesto for days. Overriding her instincts and ignoring the pleas of her companions, Mary grabbed her bag and told them that she was going to take the risk. She said goodbye, ran back to the waiting light blue van, opened the passenger door, and climbed inside. As soon as Mary sat down and pulled the door shut, the man immediately shifted the van into gear, pulled out onto the highway, and merged into the flow of traffic. Once they were cruising down the road, the driver turned to Mary with a polite smile and introduced himself. He said his name was Lawrence Singleton, and he confirmed that he was 50 years old. Mary introduced herself in return, and the two began to engage in casual, polite small talk. Lawrence was highly skilled at projecting an aura of safety and warmth. As they drove, his calm demeanor and gentle tone of voice completely put Mary at ease. Within a short period, her initial anxiety began to melt away entirely. To Mary, Lawrence did not look like a predator. He reminded her of her own grandfather, a kind, harmless older man who was simply doing a favor for a stranded teenager. Because she had been running on pure adrenaline and very little sleep for the past few days, the comforting environment of the moving van made Mary incredibly drowsy. She turned to Lawrence and asked if he would mind if she closed her eyes and took a quick nap while he drove. Lawrence smiled warmly and told her it was no problem at all, encouraging her to get some rest. Relieved, Mary curled up in the passenger seat, turned her body away from him, and closed her eyes. Within minutes, she fell into a deep, trusting sleep. A significant amount of time passed before Mary finally woke up. As her eyes adjusted and she looked out the passenger window, she noticed the positioning of the sun and the landmarks along the road. Her heart sank as she realized that the geography was entirely wrong. They were not traveling south towards Southern California and Nevada, they were heading in the exact opposite direction. Mary immediately turned to Lawrence and pointed out the error, telling him that they were going the wrong way. Lawrence acted surprised, hitting the steering wheel lightly and claiming that he had simply made a foolish navigational mistake. He apologized profusely, assuring her that he would find the next available exit, turn the van around, and get them back on the correct path. Mary nodded, trying to accept his excuse, but deep down, a profound sense of dread began to take root. They had traveled miles in the wrong direction. It felt statistically impossible for an experienced adult driver to make such a massive, prolonged error by accident. True to his word, however, Lawrence exited the highway, turned the light blue van around, and began driving south. This action temporarily confused Mary's instinct. If he was a dangerous kidnapper, why would he willingly turn the car back around toward her desired destination? Despite this, Mary remained completely on edge. Her senses were highly heightened, but she was careful to keep her face neutral and her voice calm. She knew she was trapped in a moving vehicle with an older, stronger adult, and she did not want to trigger an aggressive reaction by showing her intense fear or accusing him of lying. She sat silently in the passenger seat, watching the passing landscape with growing apprehension. Eventually, the van left the main interstate and entered a long, isolated stretch of secondary highway that wound through a heavily forested, densely wooded area. The surrounding trees grew thick and tall, blocking out much of the natural sunlight, and the traffic on this particular road completely thinned out until Lawrence's van was the only vehicle in sight. Suddenly, Lawrence broke the silence. He turned to Mary and announced that he needed to pull the van over immediately because he had to use the bathroom. Mary felt her stomach drop. The isolation of the forest was terrifying, but she tried to maintain her composure. She gave a tight, apprehensive nod and muttered that it was fine. As Lawrence began to slow the van down and steer it toward the edge of the road, Mary instinctively looked down at her own feet. She noticed that one of her sneakers had come completely untied. A sudden, sharp realization flashed through her mind. If this man tried to attack her, she would need to run as fast as possible, and a loose shoe would cause her to trip and fall. She knew she needed to tie the shoe immediately, but she was too terrified to bend down and do it while they were still in the front seats. The space was incredibly cramped, and she worried that making a sudden movement to tie her shoe would look highly suspicious to Lawrence, potentially causing him to launch an attack right there. She quickly decided that the moment the van came to a complete stop, she would open her door, step outside under the guise of stretching her legs, and immediately tie her laces on the solid ground. However, Lawrence did not simply pull over onto the dirt shoulder of the main road. Instead, he steered the light blue van onto a rugged, unpaved access road that cut deeply into the dense forest. As the van bumped along the dirt track, moving further and further away from the safety of the highway, absolute alarm bells began to scream inside Mary's head. She knew with absolute certainty that she was in profound danger. There was no innocent reason for a driver to navigate deep into an isolated forest just to relieve himself. Panic paralyzed her. She stared straight ahead, unable to look at Lawrence, her mind racing through every possible scenario. Should she try to jump out of the moving van? Should she scream? Should she confront him? Before she could form a coherent plan, Lawrence drove the van deep enough into the woods that they were completely invisible to anyone on the main highway. He brought the vehicle to a final stop, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the quiet forest. The moment Lawrence opened his door and stepped outside, Mary immediately opened the passenger door and scrambled out onto the dirt ground, desperate for fresh air and room to move. Keeping her head down, she immediately bent over and began reaching for her loose shoelaces, focused entirely on securing her footwear so she could prepare to run. But she never got the chance to finish. Before her fingers could tie the knot, a massive, crushing force struck her violently in the back of the head. The impact was so severe that it instantly short-circuited her nervous system, knocking her completely unconscious. Lawrence had not stepped out of the van to use the restroom. Before exiting, he had quietly reached down and grabbed a heavy hammer that he kept concealed right next to the driver's seat. He had silently walked around the front of the vehicle, crept up behind the unsuspecting 15-year-old girl, and smashed the heavy tool into her skull. When Mary finally regained consciousness, she found herself in total darkness. She was lying flat on her back on the hard metal floor in the rear cargo area of the light blue van. Her head was throbbing with excruciating, blinding pain, and she felt incredibly disoriented. As her vision slowly cleared, she looked out the rear windows of the van and realized that the vehicle was still parked in the exact same isolated spot deep within the forest. She instinctively tried to sit up and move her arms, but she immediately realized she was completely trapped. Lawrence had used heavy ropes and restraints to tie her hands and her feet securely to the interior structural frame of the van. She was pinned down, entirely immobile and completely at his mercy. Before she could fully process the horror of her restraint, she heard footsteps approaching the vehicle. Lawrence walked to the back of the van, swung the heavy rear doors wide open, and climbed into the cargo area. The polite, grandfatherly facade he had maintained on the highway was entirely gone. His face was cold, detached, and monstrous. Without saying a single word, he immediately launched a brutal, vicious, and prolonged physical and sexual assault against the bound teenager. Mary was absolutely terrified, a young child trapped in a living nightmare with a sadistic adult. She did not have the physical strength to fight back against her restraints, so she resorted to the only weapon she had left, her voice. As Lawrence assaulted her, Mary began to quietly, desperately beg for her life. Over and over again, through heavy tears, she whimpered, pleading with him to stop, promising him that if he just let her go, she would never tell a single soul what he had done to her. She promised to keep his secret forever if he would just show her a shred of mercy. Lawrence never responded to her pleas. He never spoke, he never yelled, and he never looked at her with remorse. He simply continued his horrific assault in absolute chilling silence for hours on end, ignoring her cries as the afternoon transitioned into the dark of night. Eventually, Lawrence grew physically exhausted. He finally stopped the assault, climbed out of the rear cargo area, and walked around to the front of the van. He climbed into the driver's seat, leaned his head back, and fell into a deep sleep. Back in the dark cargo hold, Mary lay in absolute agony. She spent the long night hours frantically pulling and twisting against the ropes, desperate to find some slack that would allow her to free her hands or feet. But Lawrence had tied the knots with expert, unyielding precision. The tight ropes only cut deeper into her skin, leaving her entirely unable to escape. She was left alone with her thoughts in the pitch black, weeping silently, wondering if she would ever see her family again, and fearing what this monster would do to her when he woke up. In the middle of the night, Lawrence suddenly awoke. Without uttering a word to the terrified girl in the back, he started the van's engine, shifted into gear, and drove out of the forest access road. He navigated back onto the main highway and drove through the darkness for a significant distance. Mary lay in the back, shifting violently with the movement of the van, completely unaware of where they were going. Eventually, Lawrence turned off the highway onto another remote access road, driving deep into an entirely different wilderness area. This time, he navigated the van down into the deep, rocky isolation of a massive desert canyon, far away from any potential witnesses or prying eyes. He brought the van to a final stop, walked around to the back, and opened the doors once again. Mary, battered and weeping, began her desperate begging all over again, crying out for freedom. But Lawrence remained entirely deaf to her suffering. He climbed back into the van, and the horrific torture and assault resumed, continuing unabated through the final hours of the night until the dark sky finally began to break and the morning sun rose over the canyon walls. When the sunlight finally illuminated the interior of the van, Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the vehicle and stood on the dirt ground, staring in at his victim. He reached forward and, to Mary's immense shock, began to untie the heavy restraints that bound her limbs. He pulled her battered, bloodied body out of the cargo hold and forced her to stand upright on her feet. Mary was entirely weak, her body covered in deep bruises and blood, her spirit nearly broken. Believing that this might be the moment of her release, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered a final plea, asking him to please just let her go home. Lawrence looked at her with a cruel, mocking expression. He repeated her words back to her, stating that since she wanted to be set free so badly, he was going to set her free. He walked away from her toward the front of the van, reached into a heavy metal toolbox, and pulled out a sharp, heavy-duty hatchet. Mary had only a fraction of a second to realize what was happening before Lawrence closed the distance between them. In one fluid, terrifying motion, he used his left hand to firmly grab Mary's left wrist, anchoring her arm in place. With his right hand, he raised the heavy hatchet high into the air and brought it down with massive force onto her left forearm. The sharp blade sliced cleanly through her flesh, muscle, and bone, completely severing her left arm off her body just below the elbow joint. The sheer shock and physical trauma caused Mary to fall backward onto the hard dirt ground. She stared down in absolute horror at the gaping, spurting wound where her left arm had been just moments before. Her brain struggled to process the unimaginable agony. But before she could even scream, Lawrence stepped over her. He reached down with his left hand, grabbed her right wrist, and pinned it down. Mary knew with absolute certainty what was coming next. Terrified and fighting for her life, she began to scream at the top of her lungs, kicking her legs out violently, striking Lawrence's body with all the remaining strength she possessed in a desperate bid to force him off her. But Lawrence's grip on her right wrist was unyielding. He raised the hatchet again and began hacking at her right forearm. It took 4 separate, brutal, agonizing blows of the hatchet to finally cut through the bone and completely sever her right arm from her body. Mary collapsed into a crumpled heap on the ground, bleeding profusely from both of her severed limbs, her body experiencing a level of physical pain that few human beings have ever survived. As she lay there screaming, Lawrence did not look at her face. Instead, his attention was completely caught by something bizarre and horrific. When he had severed Mary's left arm, her hand had instinctively clutched onto the sleeve of his shirt in a final death grip. Now, her severed left hand was still firmly attached to his clothing. With an air of absolute indifference and nonchalance, Lawrence stood over her, completely ignoring her screams, and began casually flicking his arm, trying to shake the severed hand off his sleeve. After a few moments, the hand finally detached and fell to the earth. Lawrence turned his attention back to Mary and noticed that she had suddenly gone entirely silent. Her body had gone completely limp, and she was lying motionless in a massive, expanding pool of her own blood. Believing that she had finally succumbed to blood loss and shock, Lawrence calmly walked back to his van, placed the bloody hatchet inside his toolbox, and walked back over to her seemingly lifeless body. He grabbed Mary by her shoulders and began dragging her body across the dirt ground, leaving a thick trail of blood in his wake. About 100 feet down the remote canyon road, the path ran directly over a massive concrete culvert, a giant drainage tunnel built deep underneath the roadway to allow water and heavy storm runoff to pass safely beneath the concrete without washing the road away. This particular culvert was constructed roughly 30 feet below the actual surface of the road. If a person stood on the edge of the road, there was a steep, near-vertical 30-foot drop-off down onto a bed of jagged rocks and boulders that surrounded the opening of the drainage tunnel. Lawrence dragged Mary's limp body directly to the edge of this precipice. Without a single hint of hesitation, he threw her body over the side, sending her plunging 30 feet down through the air to smash violently against the jagged rocks below. Lawrence then carefully navigated his way down the steep dirt embankment to the bottom of the canyon. He walked over to her crumpled body, picked her up, and stuffed her deep inside the dark, cold concrete interior of the culvert drainage pipe, hiding her from view. As he turned his back to walk away and leave her to die alone in the wilderness, he looked into the tunnel and uttered a final, chilling sentence. "Now you're free." But miracles do happen, and Mary Vincent was not dead. Legally, medically, and physically, she should have died at multiple different points during this horrific sequence of events. She should have died from the initial hammer blow, the massive blood loss from 2 severed limbs, the shock of the amputations, or the severe internal trauma of being thrown down a 30-foot cliff onto solid rock. But against all mathematical and medical odds, her heart kept beating. Later in her life, Mary would recount the terrifying reality that she was completely lucid, fully conscious, and profoundly aware of everything that happened to her during the entire attack, except for the brief moment she was knocked out by the hammer. She vividly remembered the sensation of her arms being severed. She recalled that when Lawrence first grabbed her left wrist, she had instinctively clamped her fingers down onto his shirt sleeve, trying to anchor herself. When the hatchet came down and severed her arm, she remembered falling backward, but her brain experienced a strange phenomenon where time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. As she fell through the air, she looked up and literally saw her own severed hand still firmly gripping the sleeve of Lawrence's shirt, detached from her body. When Lawrence began hacking at her right arm, Mary realized that if she continued to scream, kick, and fight, he would realize she was still alive and would likely use the hatchet to cut her throat or smash her skull. In a moment of supreme instinctual genius, she forced her entire body to go completely limp. She kept her eyes half open, maintaining a blank, glazed stare, and completely stopped breathing out loud. She watched through her eyelashes as Lawrence casually flicked her severed hand off his arm. She remained absolutely still and silent as he dragged her across the dirt, and she did not make a single sound or whimper when he threw her body off the 30-foot drop-off. The fall broke 4 of her ribs and caused immense internal agony, but her fierce will to survive told her that she had to endure the punishment in absolute silence, or he would finish her off. She lay perfectly still inside the dark concrete culvert, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away, followed by the distant sound of his van engine starting up and driving off into the distance. Even after the van left, Mary did not immediately move. She worried that Lawrence might have parked his van further up the road and could be waiting at the top of the cliff, watching to see if she would crawl out. She forced herself to lie in a contorted, agonizing position inside the cold pipe for a long time. Eventually, the extreme blood loss began to take its toll, and an overwhelming, heavy wave of fatigue washed over her. She felt herself slipping toward unconsciousness, but she suddenly heard a distinct, powerful voice echoing inside her own mind. The voice told her with absolute clarity, "You cannot go to sleep. If you go to sleep right now, you are going to die. And if you die, this monster will get away with what he did, and he will do this to someone else." This thought triggered a massive, life-saving surge of adrenaline through her system. Mary made a definitive decision. She was going to live, and she was going to bring her attacker to justice. She slowly dragged her broken body out of the dark culvert. Once she was out on the canyon floor, she looked at the raw, bleeding nubs of her forearms. Knowing that she was rapidly bleeding to death, she dug the exposed bones and flesh of her arms directly into the dirt and mud, manually packing the open wounds with soil to create a crude, natural tourniquet to stop the bleeding. Then she realized that if she walked with her arms down, the gravity would cause her remaining blood and muscle tissue to slip out of the wounds. She raised her mutilated forearms high above her head and began the impossible task of climbing up the steep 30-foot embankment. Using her feet, her knees, and her broken ribs, she crawled and scratched her way up the dirt cliff until she finally reached the edge of the road. She was completely naked, covered from head to toe in thick mud, dirt, and her own blood, looking like a figure from a horror movie. She began to run down the highway, desperate for help. A car soon approached, but the driver was so utterly terrified by the sight of a blood-soaked, armless figure running down the road in the middle of nowhere that they panicked, stepped on the gas, and drove right past her. Refusing to give up, Mary kept running. She ran for 3 agonizing miles down the hot highway under the morning sun until she finally managed to flag down another vehicle. This car was occupied by a young couple. Though they were initially struck with absolute horror and shock by Mary's appearance, they quickly realized she was a victim in desperate need of help. They lifted her into their vehicle and sped down the highway toward the nearest hospital. Mary Vincent spent the next full month in the hospital undergoing intensive surgeries to save her life, treat her broken ribs, and clean her infected arm wounds. Throughout her grueling physical recovery, her mind remained sharp. She met with police detectives and provided them with an incredibly precise, highly detailed description of Lawrence Singleton, his physical features, his age, and the exact appearance of his light blue passenger van. Using her stellar memory, forensic artists created a highly accurate composite sketch of the attacker, which was immediately broadcast across television news and printed in local newspapers. Not long after the sketch was released, one of Lawrence Singleton's neighbors recognized the drawing and the description of the van. The neighbor contacted the police, leading to Singleton's immediate arrest. He was brought to trial, where Mary Vincent bravely took the witness stand, looked her attacker in the eye, and testified in detail about the horrors he had inflicted upon her. Singleton was found guilty of multiple counts, including kidnapping, rape, and attempted murder. However, due to the specific laws of California in 1978, the maximum sentence the judge could legally hand down for these crimes was a mere 14 years in prison. The judge expressed immense frustration, stating on the record that he wished he could lock Singleton away for life, but his hands were legally tied by the statute. As Mary was leaving the courthouse following the sentencing, she had to walk directly past Singleton. He leaned in close to the young girl, lowered his voice, and whispered a terrifying promise. "I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." Because of automatic prison credits for good behavior and his work as a teacher's assistant behind bars, Lawrence Singleton was paroled in 1986, having served just 8 years of his 14-year sentence. His release sparked massive public outrage and protests across California. Mary, who had since grown up, gotten married, and given birth to 2 sons, was absolutely paralyzed with fear. She spent years looking over her shoulder, terrified that her stalker would fulfill his vow to finish the job and murder her and her children. But Singleton did not go after Mary. Instead, he relocated to Florida, where his violent, predatory nature inevitably resurfaced. In 1997, nearly 20 years after his attack on Mary, Singleton brutally attacked and murdered a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes in his home. He stabbed her multiple times, ending her life. At his murder trial in Florida, Mary Vincent bravely traveled to the courtroom to testify against him once again, providing the jury with first-hand evidence of his history of extreme sadistic violence. Her powerful testimony was instrumental in helping the prosecution secure a definitive death sentence for Singleton. However, before the state of Florida could execute him, Lawrence Singleton died of cancer in a prison hospital room in the year 2001. When Mary received the news of his death, she admitted to feeling deeply cheated that he had died of natural causes rather than facing the executioner. However, her sons expressed immense relief that the monster who had haunted their mother's life was finally gone forever, and Mary took great solace in knowing he could never hurt another soul. The widespread public fury over Singleton's early release in California, combined with the tragic preventable death of Roxanne Hayes, led directly to a major overhaul of the American legal system. Lawmakers drafted and passed a landmark piece of legislation known as the Lawrence Singleton Bill. This law fundamentally changed sentencing guidelines for violent crimes, giving judges the explicit legal authority to hand down sentences of 25 years to life for any criminal acts that involved explicit torture, aggravated mayhem, or the intentional mutilation of a victim's body. Under the rules of this bill, if Lawrence Singleton had committed his horrific crimes against Mary Vincent today, he would never have been granted parole, he would never have walked free, and Roxanne Hayes would still be alive. Mary Vincent refused to let her trauma define the rest of her existence. She went on to become a highly accomplished artist and an outspoken advocate for victims of violent crime. Using custom-designed prosthetic arms that she learned to master with incredible dexterity, she reclaimed her life, her independence, and her joy, standing as a permanent symbol of the unbreakable power of the human spirit. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. A woman called a moving company in New York and suddenly realized something was terribly wrong. The employee who answered the phone told her that her 8-year-old daughter, Eliza, never showed up for work that day. At first, the woman said nothing. Then her breathing changed. Her voice started trembling. And before hanging up, she quietly said she needed to call 911 immediately. Just moments earlier, she had walked into her house and found the entire place destroyed. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered everywhere. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, was something waiting that would horrify detectives for months to come. That night, the 10th of August 2005, investigators in New York began looking into what appeared to be a violent home invasion. But as the evidence started coming together, they realized the killer wasn't a stranger who broke into the house. The killer was someone who had already been standing beside the family the entire time. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button. You'll save them a seat at the movies, but then you put your code on it instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, the 10th of August 2005, 8-year-old Eliza Parsi was sitting on her bed in her Staten Island home, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet. Her mother, Seema, was at work, so Eliza had the place to herself until her own shift started later. Eliza had just graduated high school a few months earlier and was working as a clerk at a moving company. She was saving up for college, but her real dream was to move into Manhattan and work in the fashion industry. Still, she felt a little guilty about leaving. It would mean her mom would be all alone in the big house. Eliza's parents, who were both from Israel, had divorced about 1.5 years before. Her father had moved back to Israel, leaving just her and her mom in New York. Eliza did have 2 older half-brothers from her mom's first marriage. One was also in Israel. The other, her 7-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived a short drive away. But they rarely saw him. Raviv was married with a new baby and was in charge of the family's struggling kosher cookie business. He was always busy, always stressed about money, and just didn't make it out to Staten Island much. Eliza got to the last page of her magazine and saw it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift. But first, she wanted to check her messages on her online dating profiles. So she went over to her desk and logged into her computer. Back in 2005, internet dating was just taking off, and Eliza had made a few profiles to see what would happen. She'd started messaging and meeting up with men from all over the city, but she kept it a secret from her mother. She knew Seema wouldn't approve of her dating men who weren't from their Orthodox Jewish faith. Eliza knew this for a fact because it had happened with her last boyfriend, Hassan. He was a Muslim boy she'd met at her public high school. Her family had completely disapproved of the relationship because of his religion. The pressure became too much, and Eliza eventually broke up with him. So now, she was much more secretive. She'd make up excuses to go to other neighborhoods when really she was going on dates. She had even started secretly bringing some of the guys back to her house, always sneaking them in through the back door when her mom was at work. Eliza saw a few new messages and replied to them. Then she headed into the bathroom to take a shower. A few minutes later, she turned off the water and heard a noise from outside the bathroom. She'd heard a landscaping crew next door earlier, but this was different. It was a weird banging sound. Thinking it might just be the landscapers next door, Eliza stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel tightly around herself. Then, she slowly opened the bathroom door to see where the noise was coming from. But someone was already inside the house. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, got home. She put her key in the front door, but it would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it. Confused, Seema shoved against the door until she could squeeze inside. The first thing she saw was that a heavy mirror had been propped against the door. Before she could process why, she turned on the lights and saw her living room was completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were open, and papers were everywhere. Seema immediately felt her heart start pounding. Someone had broken into the house. But then another thought hit her. Where was Eliza? Seema knew her daughter had been home. She started calling out her name, but there was no answer. She ran upstairs and saw that the door to Eliza's room was closed. She tried the handle, but it was locked. This was wrong. Eliza never locked her door. In a panic, Seema banged on the door, screaming Eliza's name. But there was only silence. She pulled out her phone and called the moving company. When Eliza's boss told her she'd never shown up for work, Seema's stomach dropped. With trembling hands, she hung up and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the NYPD arrived. The street was swarming with neighbors, and yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front yard. He parked and walked to the house, where two patrol officers met him. They told him they'd responded to a robbery call, had to break down a locked bedroom door, and inside, they found the body of one 8-year-old Eliza Parsi. The officers said the whole house was torn apart, but they couldn't find any sign of a forced entry. They pointed to Seema, who was standing nearby with a young man. Kenny knew he'd have to talk to her, but first, he needed to see the scene for himself. Inside, the living room was a mess, but Kenny noticed that valuable items like the TV and stereo were sitting out in the open, untouched. That was unusual for a burglary. He went upstairs to Eliza's room. It was also ransacked. Clothes were everywhere, and the mattress was pulled off the bed, leaning against a wall. In the middle of the floor was Eliza's body. She was naked, with a towel bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked a crime scene tech if this was how they found her. The tech said no. When they first arrived, Eliza had been underneath the mattress with a pillow over her face. They had to move both to examine her. Kenny knelt down but couldn't see an obvious cause of death, no bullet or knife wounds. This suggested she might have been suffocated, maybe with that pillow. He asked if they'd found any signs of injury. The tech pointed to a few tiny drops of blood on the towel. They were small and could have been old. But all the details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, made Kenny suspect she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. He told the tech to collect the blood and any other fluids as evidence. A few minutes later, Kenny went outside to speak with Seema. She was crying on the shoulder of a young man who immediately stepped forward when he saw Kenny. He demanded to know why they couldn't see Eliza and why the police weren't out arresting her killer. Kenny took a deep breath. This was clearly Eliza's brother, and his anger was understandable. Kenny calmly explained that to find the killer, he needed information, starting with where he and Seema had been that day. The man lowered his voice and introduced himself as Raviv. He and Seema both said they had been at work all day and had alibis. Kenny then asked if they knew anyone who would want to harm Eliza. He saw them exchange a knowing glance. Raviv immediately said Kenny should look into her ex-boyfriend Hassan. Seema added that just a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her. She said it terrified Eliza, who had no idea how he'd gotten inside. Before Kenny could ask another question, Raviv suddenly started yelling at someone across the yard. "Get out! We don't want you here!" Kenny turned and saw a teenage boy standing there, looking scared. Raviv then turned back to Kenny and yelled at him to arrest that boy, Hassan, because he was the one who killed Eliza. Late that night, Detective Kenny sat in an interrogation room with Hassan. So far, Hassan had been cooperative, but he didn't have a solid alibi for the time Eliza was likely killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from him, as well as from Seema and Raviv, to compare against the evidence found at the scene. But DNA results took weeks back in 2005, so Kenny hoped for a confession. He asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. Hassan didn't deny it. He admitted he had, but insisted he was just trying to talk to her to get back together. He said Eliza wasn't terrified, just annoyed, and told him to leave. Kenny noted the difference between Hassan's story and Seema's. He asked why Eliza's family disliked him so much. Hassan hung his head and said it was about religion. He was Muslim and they were Orthodox Jewish. Kenny wasn't sure what to believe. Was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend, or were they just star-crossed lovers? Either way, he had a motive and a history of sneaking into her house. But with no confession and no hard evidence, Kenny had to let him go. The next day was Eliza's funeral, held so quickly due to Orthodox custom. Kenny had just received the autopsy report. It confirmed Eliza died from asphyxiation, likely smothered by the pillow. The medical examiner also found semen showing she'd had sex within 24 hours of her death and skin cells under her fingernails suggesting she fought back. But here was the twist. The report concluded the sex had been consensual. There were no signs of sexual violence. This meant the killer was likely a romantic partner, which seemed to clear her family. But it also didn't seem to be a random burglar since nothing was stolen. At the synagogue, Kenny saw two groups, members of the Orthodox community and Eliza's friends from school. He stood in the back of the men's section and watched. The atmosphere was solemn. Then, suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. It was Hassan. He was trying to make his way to the casket. Raviv saw him, marched straight over, shoved him, and yelled at him to get out. Before a fight could break out, other men separated them and escorted Hassan out of the building. 2 weeks later, on August 24th, Kenny was with the NYPD computer crime unit. Eliza's friends had told him about her secret online dating life. The IT specialists dug into her computer and found a message thread with a man named Jonathan. They were making plans to meet at her house for sex on August 9th, the day before she was killed. Eliza told him to come to her house while her mom was at work and that she'd leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in. This plan matched the crime scene perfectly. Kenny tracked Jonathan down. He admitted he'd gone to her house and they'd had consensual sex, but he insisted he never went back to Staten Island after that. He gave a DNA sample without hesitation. Weeks passed and the case went cold. Kenny had nothing solid on Hassan or Jonathan. Then, on September 13th, the medical examiner called. The DNA results were in. The semen sample didn't match the skin cells under Eliza's fingernails. There was DNA from two different men. The semen belonged to Jonathan, confirming his story of consensual sex the day before. The skin cells found under Eliza's fingernails from her desperate fight for her life belonged to her half-brother, Raviv. Raviv was angry at his mother. The family cookie business she'd passed to him was failing, and he felt humiliated living in his in-laws' basement with his wife and new baby. He knew Seema had money from her recent divorce, money he felt was rightfully his. So on August 10th, instead of driving his delivery route, he went to his mother's house to steal it. He didn't know Eliza's work schedule had changed and that she would be home. Before searching the house, Raviv dragged a heavy mirror in front of the front door, creating a barricade in case someone unexpectedly came home. When he went into Eliza's room, he was shocked to find her coming out of the bathroom. He knew she would tell their mother what he was doing. In a panic, he tackled her, smothered her with a pillow until she stopped fighting, and then staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He then left, only to return hours later after his mother called him, pretending to be a grieving brother. Raviv eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In the end, the person demanding justice the loudest outside the crime scene was the same person who had killed Eliza only hours earlier. Raviv had publicly blamed Hassan, comforted his grieving mother, and stood beside detectives pretending to mourn his sister. But the entire time, the killer had already been there. Hours earlier, when Seema called Eliza's workplace searching for her daughter, Eliza was already dead inside the house. And the person she should have been safest around turned out to be the one she needed protection from most. Thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. If you want to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time. In 2018, a 21-year-old man named Derek was just starting his career as a police officer. He was young, full of energy, and ready to take on the world. But his personal life had just taken a major hit. His longtime girlfriend, the woman he had actually moved to Colorado for to be closer to, had just broken up with him. The breakup came out of nowhere, and it completely blindsided him. One day they were planning their future, the next she was telling him it was over. And so Derek was devastated. He spent the next few weeks in a deep funk. He'd go to work, come home, and just sit on his couch, replaying everything in his head. He was just going through the motions, feeling totally alone in a new state where he barely knew anyone besides his ex. One evening, one of his close friends came over to check on him. He saw Derek just moping around and said, "Hey man, look, I know you're hurting, but you can't just waste away like this. You need to get back out there." Derek just shook his head, not really interested. But his friend kept pushing. He said, "Why don't you make a profile on Tinder? It's an online dating app. Just put yourself out there again. You have no idea who you might meet. Clearly, your ex wasn't the one for you, so it's time to see who is." Derek was hesitant. He'd never done online dating before. He'd met his ex-girlfriend in a bar, and every other girl he'd dated he'd met in person through friends or at school. The idea of swiping on pictures of strangers felt weird and impersonal to him. It just wasn't on his radar at all. But as he sat there in his empty apartment, the loneliness was getting to be too much. His friend was right. He had to do something. He figured, you know what? I have absolutely nothing to lose. And so, with his friend's help, he downloaded the app and made himself a Tinder profile. He didn't expect much to come of it, but to his surprise, Derek quickly matched with a woman named Leah. When he saw her profile, he thought she was way out of his league. She was beautiful, had a great smile, and seemed really fun and adventurous in her pictures. He was almost intimidated, but he figured he'd send a message anyway. They started chatting, and right away they just clicked. The conversation flowed easily. They texted back and forth for a couple of weeks, talking about everything and nothing. They eventually moved on to phone calls, and they got along great. They had the same sense of humor and similar interests. Derek started to feel excited about something for the first time since the breakup. After a few weeks of constant communication, they both knew they wanted to meet in person. But there was a bit of a logistical problem. Leah lived well over an hour away from Derek's place. There wasn't a natural, halfway meeting spot that made sense for a first date. They were going back and forth, throwing out ideas for restaurants or coffee shops, but nothing seemed quite right. Finally, Leah just said, "Hey, I have an idea. Why don't you just come to my town? There's this great park that I go running in all the time. It has this awesome, huge field that's on a slope. You can lay on it and look up through the trees and see all the stars. It's really beautiful." She suggested that for their first date, they could go stargazing together. Derek thought that sounded perfect. It was romantic, unique, and took all the pressure off. So the date night finally came, and Derek was genuinely excited. He was also really nervous. Even though they'd talked on the phone for hours and felt like they knew each other, this would be the first time they'd ever see each other in person. The plan was for him to drive out to her town and pick her up directly from her work. She told him she worked at a hair salon. From there, they would make their way over to the park she had described. Derek got in his car and made the hour-long drive, his stomach filled with a mix of nerves and anticipation. He pulled up to the hair salon right as Leah was walking outside. She spotted his car, and her face lit up with a huge smile. She was waving enthusiastically as she ran over and hopped in the passenger seat. They gave each other a quick, slightly awkward hug and a kiss on the cheek. It was a strange feeling. It was like they knew each other so well, but they also didn't know each other at all. Their entire relationship had been built through texts and phone calls, so they had this history, but it wasn't a physical one. But any awkwardness melted away pretty quickly. Derek was really happy to finally meet her, and it seemed like Leah was just as happy to meet him. From the hair salon, it was a pretty short drive to the access road that was supposed to take them into the park. Leah was giving him directions, and she told him to make a turn onto this side road. As he turned, Derek felt a little uneasy. It didn't look like a very well-marked trail, or even a marked entrance to a park. It looked more like a random, unpaved access road that he normally wouldn't even think about driving down. He wouldn't have associated this path with the big, popular public park she had described. But, he reminded himself, he didn't know the area. She did. So, he trusted her and continued down the road. Pretty quickly, the road went from pavement to dirt. It was bumpy and poorly maintained. The whole time, he was thinking to himself, did I take a wrong turn? Does she actually know where she's going? This does not feel like the right way to get to a big park. It felt remote and isolated. Just as his anxiety was starting to build, they finally landed back on a paved road. And right there, next to the road, was this huge open field, just like she had described. So right away, Derek's stress vanished. It was confirmed in his mind that, okay, that was a weird way to get into this park, but here's this huge, amazing field, and we're back on a real road. Everything's good again. Derek asked Leah, where should I park? They were on this really narrow road, and there didn't appear to be a designated parking lot anywhere. There also didn't appear to be anyone else around. It was this huge, open, beautiful space, but it didn't look well populated or like it was a popular spot. It was strangely empty. But she just pointed up the road and said, just go right up there. There's a small lot you can pull into. So Derek started driving slowly up the road. He could see, maybe 300 feet ahead of him, the dim headlights of another car making its way down the road coming towards him. It was dark enough now that he couldn't really make out what kind of vehicle it was. He didn't know if it was going to be a big truck or something that would need a lot of space. So, being cautious, he just pulled his car over as far to the right side of the road as he could to allow this other vehicle plenty of room to pass. Even though there was a fair amount of distance they would need to cover before they actually passed him, he figured it was better to just give them the right of way. As the other vehicle got closer, he could see that it was actually a big van. It was moving pretty slowly, and he was just kind of waiting for it to go by him. He wasn't thinking anything of it. He just assumed it was another person enjoying the park, maybe leaving for the night. But then, something strange happened. Instead of passing him, the van, at the last second, turned its wheel and pulled right in front of Derek's car, stopping almost bumper to bumper. It didn't crash into him, but it completely blocked his path. Now, Derek is a cop. He's a brand new cop, and he's super gung-ho. He really believes in his training and his instincts. And as soon as this van stopped in front of him, blocking him in, red flags started going up all over the place in his mind. He knew something was wrong with this situation. Instinctively, he turned to Leah and said in a firm voice, "Leah, stay here." He reached into the center console, grabbed the powerful flashlight he always kept there, and he jumped out of his car. He didn't hesitate. He went right to the driver's side door of the van to confront this guy. When he got up to the driver's side window, he saw a really big guy behind the wheel. The man looked pretty startled to see Derek come charging up to his vehicle, flashlight in hand. Derek shone the light on him and said, "What are you doing, man? What are you blocking me in for?" The guy in the van put his hands up and said, "Oh, hey, sorry. I'm the caretaker here for this whole property. We've had a big issue with poachers in the area recently, and I was concerned you guys might be poachers." "It doesn't look like you're poachers, though." Derek relaxed a little bit. The explanation seemed plausible. He said, "No, we're not poachers. We're just here to go stargazing." "I'm on a first date." The caretaker's face softened, and he smiled. "Oh man, I am so sorry," he said. "Please, get back in your car. Go and enjoy your night." "My apologies." And with that, the man backed up his van, did a three-point turn on the narrow road, and drove right back up the way he came from, disappearing over the top of the hill. Derek stood in front of his car for a couple of minutes, just watching, making sure the van was really gone. Once he was satisfied, he turned around and got back in his car. He was still a little keyed up from the encounter, but he tried to make a joke of it to Leah. He turned to her and said, "Yeah, he thought we were poachers. I guess you look like a poacher to him, and that's why he stopped us." He smiled, expecting her to laugh, or at least react. But when he looked over at Leah, she wasn't paying attention to him at all. She was just furiously typing away on her phone, her thumbs moving a mile a minute. Derek thought that was a little bit odd. You'd think she would be more interested in the strange thing that had just happened. Some weird guy in a van just blocked them in on a dark road, and he had to get out and confront him. You'd think she'd be interested on some level. Maybe she'd want to know what he said to the guy, or what the guy said to him. But she didn't seem to care at all. She was just really invested in whoever she was messaging on her phone. Derek just shrugged it off, thinking, whatever. He threw the car back in drive and continued up the road the way they were going before they were stopped. A little ways further up, Derek saw the small dirt lot that Leah had mentioned. It was butted up right against the huge field they were going to be hanging out on for the night. He pulled into the lot, backed his car into a space, and he and Leah got out. They grabbed a blanket from the trunk, along with some food and a bottle of wine they'd brought. They spread the blanket out on the grass, right next to the car on the hill, and they sat down. Very quickly, the weirdness of the van encounter faded away. They started swapping stories, they were laughing, they were stargazing, and they were drinking some wine. Everything was really great. It felt like the perfect first date. After about an hour, it was totally dark outside. The stars were brilliant. Derek was laying on the blanket on the hill, facing back towards his car and the road they had been on. He happened to glance up to his left, towards the top of the hill. It was the same area where the van had come from originally, and where it had gone back to after their strange conversation. Derek was looking out there, and he saw headlights. It was the van. And this time, the van wasn't driving down the road leisurely like it was before. It was flying down the hill, moving fast. Before Derek or Leah had a chance to react to this van barreling down on them, it came flying into the small parking lot. It didn't stop until it practically hit his car, coming to a screeching halt in a way that completely boxed his car in. Even if he got in his car, he couldn't drive away. Derek jumped up. Leah jumped up too. The driver's side door of the van flew open, and the guy, the so-called nice caretaker he had talked to before, hopped out. He walked around the front of the van, and this time he had a heavy metal pipe in his hand. He looked right at Derek and said, "Give me your keys and your wallet." Again, Derek is this brand new 21-year-old cop. He's not about to let some guy just push him around and rob him. So, at first, he didn't do anything. He was processing the situation, trying to figure out his next move. He just stood there and looked at this guy, showing him that he wasn't just going to fall over because he told him to. But then, Derek was given a huge, shocking curveball. Leah, his date, the woman he'd been having a great time with for the past 2 hours, stood up, ran over to the man with the pipe, and stood right next to him. She turned around, looked straight at Derek, and said, "Come on, give us your keys and your wallet." Derek just stared, his mind reeling. He thought, great, I'm getting set up by my Tinder date. This girl, who I thought I had a real connection with, he was in total shock. He just stood there, doing nothing. Not because he was trying to be tough anymore, but because he was paralyzed by the betrayal. He felt so stupid. How could this have happened? How could he have been so wrong about her? In that moment of his stunned silence, Leah walked to the back of the van. She opened the rear doors, reached inside, and pulled out another metal pipe. She came back around to the front and stood next to the big guy. She looked at Derek again and said, "Derek, give us your keys and your wallet. We don't want to have to hurt you." This is when Derek's police training finally kicked in and overrode the shock. He looked at them both, standing there with their pipes, and he said, simply, "No." As soon as the word left his mouth, the big guy lunged at him and tackled him to the ground. But Derek could handle himself. He was fit and had been through the academy. He fought back, and very quickly, he was able to get back up on his feet. As he stood up, he drew his concealed carry pistol, which he was authorized to carry off-duty. He aimed it back and forth between the big guy and Leah. He yelled, "I'm a cop. Put your hands up." Now. As soon as they saw the gun, their whole demeanor changed. They both dropped their pipes and immediately put their hands up in the air. So, as he's holding them both at gunpoint, he's looking over at Leah, his mind just screaming, "Really? You did this to me? Are you kidding me right now?" But he couldn't get lost in his anger. He had a procedure to follow. While keeping his gun trained on them, he had to get his cell phone out of his pocket with his other hand. He had to unlock it, type in 911, and then call dispatch. When the operator answered, he had to explain who he was, give his badge number, explain what had happened, and, most importantly, tell them where he was. And describing his location was difficult. It was a dark, unmarked park. As he's trying to explain the directions to the dispatcher, saying things like, "Yeah, you go left at the light, and then there's a gas station there, and then you're going to go up this hill, you're going to see me. I've got two people at gunpoint." He's completely focused on the call. As he's doing that, Leah and the caretaker look at each other. They see their opportunity. They figure he's distracted. They can at least get behind the van and run into the forest before he can catch them. And that's exactly what they did. They turned around and just bolted. They ran for the tree line. Instinctively, Derek took off running after them. He chased them for about 30 seconds into the trees before he started hearing gunshots. And they weren't his gunshots. Someone was shooting at him from the darkness. He saw a muzzle flash out in the middle of the forest. And he thought, "Yeah, I'm not doing this. This was no longer a robbery. This was an ambush." He turned around, ran back to his vehicle, and jumped inside. He started it up, but he was still boxed in by the van. He had to basically smash his car into the van, then back into the fence, over and over again, like that scene from Austin Powers. It was like a 25-point turn before he was barely able to grind his way out of the lot and peel out of that park. Derek drove until he found the nearest gas station. He pulled in, his heart still pounding, and called dispatch again. He said, "Hey, I just called 911 like 5 or 10 minutes ago, and I dropped the call because I was chasing somebody. Here's my name. Here's my badge number. I'm now at this gas station. Can you send a couple of police officers over to my location now?" They said, "Yep, we'll send a unit to you." A few minutes later, a police cruiser showed up with 2 officers inside that Derek recognized. They were senior to him. They got out, and he explained again, from the beginning, what had happened. They kind of gave him a hard time, joking with him for getting catfished on his very first online date. But at the same time, they knew this could have gone really, really badly. So they decided they were going to load up in the police cruiser together, all 3 of them, and drive back up to the park to see if the van was still there. They drove back up the dark, winding road and into the park. As they approached the small dirt lot, Derek pointed ahead and said, "That's the van. It's still here." They drove up and stopped short of the van. The 2 uniformed officers turned to Derek and said, "Just stay in here. We're going to go check this van out." So Derek sat in the back of the cruiser, watching as the 2 senior officers approached the vehicle with their guns drawn. They were cautious, looking all around, clearing the area behind the van, scanning the wood line with their flashlights. There was nobody there. At some point, he saw them put their pistols away. They opened the doors to the van and started shining their flashlights all around inside. They looked in the back, they looked in the front. After a few minutes, they closed the doors and walked back to the cruiser. As soon as they got back in the car, Derek could tell there was just something off about how they were acting. When they were down at the gas station, they were kind of joking around with him, giving him a hard time. But now, whatever they had seen in that van, it was definitely not something they were going to joke about. The mood was heavy and serious. One of them turned to him and said, "The back of the van, it was just filled with knives and saws. There were pistols and rifles, lighter fluid, chains, handcuffs, duct tape. It was awful." He paused and then added, "And it looks like there might even be blood on the ground back there." The two officers immediately called in additional backup. Before long, that little dirt lot was a full-fledged crime scene. The forensics unit arrived, other police officers showed up, and they set up big spotlights. They went out looking in the woods for the man and the woman, but they never found them. They were gone. During the investigation, Derek told the other officers, "Hey, she told me she works at this hair salon right down the road. I picked her up there." So a couple of investigators went over to the hair salon. They talked to the owner and the employees there. They showed them a picture of Leah. But everyone at the salon said the same thing. "We've never heard of a Leah. We've never seen this woman before in our lives." They came back and they told Derek, "Look, she's a con artist. This whole thing, your whole relationship with her, has been her setting you up in some way, shape, or form. The entire thing. That's all it ever was." For Derek, that was crushing. He swore off Tinder immediately. He never wanted to do any more online dating. But what really haunts him, more than just being taken advantage of and betrayed, is the question of what would have happened if he wasn't a cop. What would have happened if he wasn't concealed carrying that night? Would he have wound up in the back of that van? In the summer of 2019, a grandmother named Barbara was looking after her grandkids for the weekend. Her daughter and her son-in-law were out of town, and Barbara was happy to step in. Her daughter had 3 kids. 2 of them were under the age of 6, and one was a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa. Anytime Barbara was looking after her grandkids for more than just a single day, especially if it was overnight, she would just stay at their house. It was easier that way, so she didn't disrupt their lives and their routines more than she needed to. Their house was a modest, single-story home in a nice, quiet suburb of Dallas, Texas. It was the kind of neighborhood where the crime rate is basically 0 and everybody knows each other. People left their doors unlocked, and kids played in the street until the sun went down. It was a safe place. This particular night that she was over there looking after them was like any other. She got the 2 little ones settled, read them stories, and put them to bed first. Then she and Alyssa stayed up a little bit later in the kitchen, chatting. They talked about school, about Alyssa's friends, just the normal stuff. Eventually, they both got tired and decided to head to bed. Because their house was a single-story home, all the bedrooms were on the only floor. Barbara's guest room and Alyssa's room were right next to each other, and both of their windows looked out onto the side of the property. As soon as Barbara got into her room, she did something she always did. She opened up the window that was right next to her bed. Ever since she was a little kid, she had always slept with the window open. Even though her daughter's house had modern air conditioning, she just preferred the fresh air. So, with the window open and the screen in place, Barbara crawled into bed and quickly fell asleep. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Barbara woke up. She was pulled from her sleep by the sound of rustling coming from right outside her window. She lay there for a moment, listening. It sounded an awful lot like it was probably just a dog or a cat, or maybe a raccoon rummaging around. It was a common sound in the suburbs, and it did not seem like a big deal to her. She was just about to roll over and go back to sleep, but then she heard it again. And this time, it sounded much more like footsteps. They sounded heavy enough that it probably couldn't be a dog or a cat. Now she was a little more alert. She rolled over onto her elbows and carefully pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out through the window screen. The moon was out that night, so there was pretty good illumination. She could clearly see the side of the house, the neat lawn, and the fence that separated their property from their neighbors. She could also see the neighbor's house, and all their lights were off. Everyone was asleep. And then she noticed something strange. Propped up against the fence, on their side of the fence, on their property, was a bicycle that she didn't recognize. She looked at it thinking, is that Alyssa's bike? No, it's too big to be either of the younger kids' bikes. Whose bike is that? As she was looking at the bike, trying to figure it out, she heard more rustling. This time, it was coming from her left, which was closer to Alyssa's room. Barbara pressed her face up against the screen to try to get a better look. Whatever was making the sound was now just out of her view. As she's got her face pressed up against the screen, straining to see, she sees a boy emerge from the bushes right underneath Alyssa's window. He was wearing one of those classic high school Letterman jackets, the kind you see football players wear in the movies. He had the hood of his jacket pulled up over his head. He didn't look over at her window. He was just backing up slowly away from Alyssa's room, and he was looking up into Alyssa's window. Barbara immediately relaxed. She thought, okay, this guy is probably one of Alyssa's friends. Maybe even a boyfriend she hadn't told anyone about yet. She figured Alyssa must have invited him over. Maybe she invited him when she knew her parents were going to be out of town, but before she found out that her grandmother was going to be there to look after them. And maybe that message just didn't get passed along to him, so he showed up anyway. All these perfectly reasonable scenarios were going through Barbara's head. But all she knew for sure was that she wasn't going to call the cops on some teenage kid who was just trying to say hi to Alyssa. Instead, she was going to confront him. Barbara was a high school teacher and had been for decades. So she had plenty of run-ins with badly behaved teenagers over the years. She was pretty good at standing her ground, being firm, and getting teenagers to listen to her. She figured she would just go out there, give him a stern talking to, and he'd get the message and leave. So, she quietly got out of her bed. She walked out of her room and went to the front of the house. The boy was over on the side of the house. She was going to come around from the front to meet him. As soon as she got outside onto the porch, she flipped on the porch lights. She quickly walked around to the edge of the porch where she could poke her head over the railing and see right down the side of the house where this kid would be standing. She poked her head over and said in her firm teacher voice, "Can I help you?" The kid turned and looked at her for the first time. And in that instant, Barbara's heart dropped. She thought, oh, whoa. He is not a teenager. He looked like he was in his 20s, if not his 30s. No matter what, he was a lot older than Alyssa. It caught her so off guard that she didn't really know how to react. She was just looking at this guy who looked so much older than he should, but he was on a bike and he was wearing a Letterman jacket. It was confusing. So Barbara was a little bit disoriented. She was thinking to herself, okay, it's possible that he could just be one of those kids that looks a lot older than he really is. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a little voice was screaming that this doesn't feel right. This feels like a grown man is trying to get into the house. As she was trying to process all of this, she was also registering that this guy, he seemed completely unfazed by being caught. He wasn't scared or embarrassed. He was just looking up at her with a blank expression. And then he started taking steps towards her, towards the porch. His calm advance was so unnerving that Barbara said, "Stop. Stop right where you are." And he did. He stopped and looked up at her, and he said, "I'm looking for Alyssa. Is she home?" Barbara was just glaring at this guy, hoping that her stern look would be enough to get him to leave. But he wasn't leaving. He was just standing there, waiting. It occurred to her that maybe this was all just a huge misunderstanding. Thinking on her feet, she decided to test him. She said to him, "Who did you say you're looking for?" "Lisa?" Without any hesitation, he replied, "No. I'm looking for Alyssa McCarran. She lives here." Barbara went silent for a second. Her blood ran cold. He was right. That was her granddaughter's full name. And she certainly was here. But Barbara did not want this man coming anywhere near the house until she had a chance to talk to Alyssa and confirm that she had invited him here. Or, at the very minimum, that she even knew who he was. So Barbara said to the guy, "I need you to stay right there. It's 3 a.m. I don't know you. Give me a minute. I'll be right back." He seemed to understand and just nodded. Barbara went back inside the house. She shut and locked the heavy front door behind her. Then she went straight into Alyssa's room. She walked over to the bed and gently shook Alyssa's foot to wake her up. Alyssa kind of sat up, blinking, looking around, confused. She was like, "What's going on?" Barbara looked at her, and at this point, she was kind of annoyed with how the night had gone. She was sort of blaming Alyssa, assuming that she had probably invited this strange creep over to their house in the middle of the night. She said to Alyssa, "Did you invite a boy here tonight?" Alyssa, still half asleep, was like, "No." "What are you talking about?" Barbara narrowed her eyes. She said, "Well, there's a boy outside that clearly knows you. He asked for you by your full name, and he knows you live here. And he's outside right now. Can you please go out there and tell him that coming over unannounced at 3 in the morning is not very polite and he shouldn't do it again?" Alyssa was totally confused. She was looking at her grandmother like she was crazy. "What are you talking about?" she asked again. So she leaned back in her bed, opened the curtain of her window, and she looked outside. Immediately, she pulled her head back in, her eyes wide with fear. She whispered, "Grandma, he asked for me by name?" And Barbara said, "Yeah, he said Alyssa McCarran lives here." Alyssa looked at her grandmother, her face pale, and said, "We have to call 911. I have never seen him before in my life." Suddenly, everything made sense for Barbara. The weird feeling, the man's age, his calm demeanor. This was a stranger. This was not a friend. This was probably a grown man, and he was probably trying to break into Alyssa's room. As she was having this terrifying realization, they both heard it. Footsteps! Out on the front porch. At this, Barbara went into full protective grandmother mode. She turned to Alyssa and said, "Stay in your bed. Do not move." Barbara ran out of Alyssa's room. She went into her own bedroom, shut the window she had opened earlier, and locked it. Then she ran to the front of the house to make sure that the front door was locked. She thought she had locked it when she came back in, but she wasn't 100% sure. She got right in front of it, and she could see that the deadbolt was thrown. It was locked. And now she was standing right on the other side of the door, her heart hammering in her chest, just waiting to see what was going to happen next. This guy was standing on her porch, but he was obscured. She couldn't see him because he was on the other side of the solid wood door. It was silent for a second. As she was standing there holding her breath, just waiting for something to happen, she heard a loud knock on the door. It startled her so much, she jumped back. She gathered herself and yelled through the door, "There's no Alyssa McCarran here! You have the wrong house! You need to leave, or I'm calling the police!" The knocking stopped for a second. Then his voice came through the door, calm and chilling. He said, "I know Alyssa lives here. Tell her to come outside." And then he went back to knocking, harder this time. Barbara grabbed her phone from her pocket and called 911. And she intentionally talked really loudly into the phone, making it very obvious that she was calling the police. She said, "Yes, hello, I need the police. There's a man trying to get into my house. He's on my front porch right now." Very clearly, the guy on the other side of the door picked up on what Barbara was doing because the knocking stopped instantly. Through the little slit of glass next to the door, she saw a shadow move. He ran to the left of the house, back towards the side where he had left his bike. Barbara, still on the phone with the 911 operator, ran back into the bedroom where she had been sleeping. She looked out the side window just in time to see the last of him. He was riding his bike across the street. Then he stopped next to a dark SUV that was parked there. He opened the trunk, threw the bike in, and then he got into the passenger side of the car. And the car drove off. Which meant whatever he had planned to do with Alyssa, whatever he was doing this night, he had an accomplice. The police showed up a couple of minutes later. By this point, the creep and whoever he was with were long gone. But Barbara still gave her statement. She gave a description of the man, the vehicle, and told them everything that had happened. The police told her something that made the whole experience even more terrifying. They said that over the past couple of weeks, they had gotten very similar reports from other households in the area, all of them homes where there were young girls living inside. Apparently, this boy was actually a grown man who would use social media to figure out where teenage girls lived. Then he would dress up like a teenager himself in a Letterman jacket and a hoodie and he would go to their houses and stalk them. Whatever Alyssa had listed on her online profiles, he had been able to use it to deduce where she lived. And who knows how long he had been standing outside, looking in the window at her at night. In 2018, an up-and-coming Instagram influencer named Wendy was contacted by a hotel in Miami, Florida. The hotel reached out to her and wanted to see if she'd be willing to stay at their property over Memorial Day weekend. They told her they were willing to cover all of her expenses. Her flight, her room, her food, everything. The only thing they asked in return was that she post a couple of times on her Instagram while she was at the hotel, showing off how great the hotel was and what a wonderful time she was having. They also told her to bring along a female friend and that they would cover all of her friends' expenses as well. Wendy was ecstatic. She was trying to make being an influencer her full-time job, and so opportunities like this, a fully paid luxury trip, were huge for her. Even though she didn't know if she had any girlfriends that would be free to go with her on such short notice, she was so eager to take them up on this opportunity that she said yes immediately. She figured she would find someone. So, over the next couple of days, she reached out to her network of friends. She texted all her best girlfriends to see if any of them wanted to come with her on a free trip to Miami. But, as it turned out, everybody was either busy with work, had already made other plans for the holiday weekend, or just wasn't that interested. Since she did not want to cancel this incredible opportunity, she thought, well, it can't be that big of a deal if I bring along a male friend instead. She reached out to her good friend Mitch. Mitch was this 6'4" athletic guy who was just one of her close platonic friends. She called him up and said, hey, would you mind coming along with me to this thing in Miami over Memorial Day weekend? I need someone to go with me. They asked for a female friend, but, you're going to have to do. Mitch thought a free trip to Miami sounded great, and he agreed to go. Wendy thought to herself, well, the worst case scenario is that the hotel isn't willing to pay for Mitch's expenses. And if that happens, she would just pay for them herself. She told Mitch as much, and they both thought that was a perfectly fine solution. So, the day of the trip arrived, and Wendy and Mitch were really excited. They didn't often get to go travel around, especially not for free as part of an influencer deal. They hopped on a plane, flew first class to Miami, and when they got there, they went down to baggage claim to get their bags. After they had their luggage, they went out to the curb to wait for their ride. Right away, Wendy saw him. There was this really well-dressed guy with dark sunglasses on, and he was holding up a sign that had her last name on it, along with the logo of the hotel. She waved to him and walked over, with Mitch following right behind her. The guy looked at her and said, okay, well, where's your friend? That's when she said, oh, well, actually, I brought Mitch. None of my girlfriends could make it, so I brought Mitch along. The guy lowered his sunglasses and looked Mitch up and down. He was a big guy, and the man seemed to be sizing him up. Then he put his sunglasses back on, turned without a word, and walked towards this beautiful black luxury SUV that was parked right up against the curb. Wendy and Mitch looked at each other, a little confused by his cold reaction, but they followed him. The guy opened up the back door of the SUV, and Wendy and Mitch got in. The guy then took their luggage and put it in the back of the vehicle and shut the hatch. As soon as Wendy and Mitch sat down inside the car, the driver, who was already in the front seat, was visibly upset. He was kind of ranting and raving, speaking loudly and angrily. The front passenger window was down, so Wendy and Mitch assumed he must be yelling at someone outside of the vehicle. Maybe the guy that had just picked them up, they thought he must be communicating with him somehow. They thought, he can't possibly be yelling at us. We just got here. We don't even know him. But sure enough, as they started to tune in to what he was actually saying, they realized he was yelling at them. He had a very thick accent, and he was saying, where is the other girl? You are not supposed to have a guy. It is two girls. Not one girl, one guy. It is two girls. Where is the other girl? As Wendy was hearing this, she felt so uncomfortable. Not just for herself, but for Mitch too. She was the one who had asked him to come along and had assured him that it wouldn't be a big deal. She had said, oh, they won't mind. But, clearly they did mind. A lot. So Wendy started trying to explain to the driver,
She said, "I know you asked for a female friend, but I didn't have a female friend who could come, so I brought him along. I will pay for him. I'm not asking you guys to pay for him. I'll pay for everything. His hotel, his flight, everything he touches." But the driver didn't seem that upset about who was paying for Mitch. His frustration seemed to come from a different place. He was frustrated, like they weren't going to be able to do whatever it was they had planned to do, because now Mitch was in the mix. So as Wendy and the driver were kind of going back and forth, and the driver was getting more and more frustrated and angry, the guy that had originally greeted Wendy and Mitch hopped into the front passenger seat. He and the driver then started arguing with each other in rapid-fire Portuguese. For about a minute, Wendy and Mitch are sitting in the back, looking at each other like, what is going on here? These guys are yelling at each other, and they had no idea what was being said. Then, they suddenly stopped. The driver turned around in his seat again, and one more time, he looked at Wendy and said, "Where is the other girl?" Wendy, now frustrated herself, said, "There is no other girl. It is Mitch and I. That is it." At this point, the driver made a sound of disgust, like he was completely fed up with both of them. He raised his hand up in a dismissive gesture and turned to face the road in front of him. The guy that had originally greeted them, the one in the passenger seat, he got out of the car. He went around to the back, opened the trunk, and took their luggage out. He threw it onto the curb. Then he went to the back door that was closest to Mitch, yanked it open, and told them to get out. So Wendy and Mitch climbed back out onto the curb, stunned and confused. The guys slammed the door shut behind them, hopped back in the front seat, and the SUV peeled away from the curb, leaving them standing there with their luggage. That was it. At this point, Wendy was thinking to herself, I bet those two guys have nothing to do with the actual hotel. The people that I have been communicating with to set this whole thing up, I bet they are just the drivers. And they were just told to pick up two girls. And when we showed up with a girl and a guy, it screwed up their instructions, and they got mad. They got really mad, I guess, and then they left. So, she thought, I bet if I can just get in touch with the people at the hotel, the people I had actually spoken to, that they can clear this whole thing up. She opened up her email on her phone and sent a message to a woman named Marissa. Marissa was one of the people at the hotel that she had been going back and forth with when she was booking her plane ticket. Then, she sent another message to the hotel's Instagram account. It was a big account with over 10,000 followers, and it was the account that had actually originally reached out to her. She'd been messaging back and forth with them quite a bit. For a couple of minutes, Wendy was just watching her phone, waiting for a response. At some point, Mitch said to her, by the time we get a response to either your Instagram DM or your email, we probably could have just taken an Uber over to the hotel and spoken to them directly. So why don't we just go do that? Wendy agreed. They called an Uber and drove the short distance to the hotel. As soon as they got out of the car, Wendy noticed something that, at the time, did not seem like a big deal. The logo of the hotel, the real one, right there in front of her on the building, it was a little bit different than the logo on the Instagram page she'd been talking to. The profile picture on that Instagram account was different than the logo on the actual hotel. That stood out to her just because she'd looked at that page so many times. But it was definitely the same hotel name, the same address. So she didn't think much of it. She and Mitch walked inside and went right up to the front desk. Wendy asked to speak with a manager. Shortly thereafter, a manager came out, and she asked Wendy and Mitch to come into her office. They went inside and sat down, and she said, "Okay, guys, what's going on?"
What do you need?
So Wendy explained the framework of the deal she had negotiated with Marissa. She said, "Look, when I got to the airport, the guys that picked us up were incredibly rude, and they wouldn't give us a ride here. I just wanted to let you know what happened. We don't care, we got a ride here ourselves, but we just figured you should know how your drivers are behaving." The woman looked at her, kind of puzzled. She said, "Who was the person you talked to?" "You said her name was Marissa?" Wendy said, "Yeah, Marissa. She's the marketing person here, I think." The manager looked at her and said, "No. I'm the marketing person. And my name's Kelly. I think you're at the wrong hotel because we don't have any influencers that are staying here right now. And I definitely would have known about this." Wendy couldn't believe it. She pulled up the Instagram page she had been talking to, and she showed it to the manager. The manager took the phone, and she was pretty surprised by what she was looking at. She said, "This is our old account. We deleted this." Or, "I thought we deleted this. We have a new one because we rebranded. We have a brand new logo, everything's new, and we just felt like we'd start fresh." So I don't know. I don't know who owns this account now, but that is our old account. It's just, we don't use it anymore. I have no idea how anyone got a hold of it. At this point, it finally clicked for Wendy. This whole thing was a facade. This whole time she was being conned. And what really scared her was, to what end? What were they trying to do with her? Had she shown up with another female friend, like they asked, what would they have done with them? But at this moment, Wendy just felt totally overwhelmed by the entire situation. She was so embarrassed that she thought this was a real opportunity. She was embarrassed that she had dragged Mitch all the way to Miami for something that was just fake. She was so embarrassed that she had just approached this manager who basically told her she had been scammed. She just wanted to leave. So she stood up and she said, "I'm really sorry for wasting your time," and she and Mitch left the office. She went outside the hotel and she just sat down on a bench and started crying. Mitch sat down next to her and said, "Hey, you really ought to call the police and let them know this happened. Because, clearly there were plans for you. And had you brought a female friend, they can't have been good plans. I think you need to let the police know that this scam exists." So Wendy did. She called the police and she explained what happened. She was surprised when the officer on the phone said, "Hey, where are you right now? We'd love to send a detective over to you to talk to you a little bit more about what happened." So Wendy told them where they were. She was a little bit surprised that they wanted to send a detective over to talk about this, because in her mind, this wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, it was a big deal to her and to Mitch, but nothing really happened to them. But either way, they went and sat on a bench right outside the hotel, and they waited for the detective to show up. Just a couple of minutes later, he did. He walked up, he introduced himself, and he said, "Hey, let's go inside and grab a table and we can chat." So they went inside and they sat down, and Wendy and Mitch went over their story one more time from the very beginning. After they were done, the detective leaned back and said, "Look, I don't mean to scare you, but I do want you to understand just how serious of a situation you guys were just in." He continued, "So, in Miami, human traffickers use these phony hotel Instagram accounts to attract young women like yourself to Miami in order to be trafficked. They will buy these old business Instagram accounts from companies that have either rebranded or who are going out of business. They'll pay top dollar to acquire those Instagram accounts, and then they will use them in order to get people like you to come to Miami. So probably the only reason they didn't follow through on their operation is because you brought Mitch along. A 6'4" man posed a threat to them. And so that's why they were so upset with you. And that's why they decided it wasn't worth the risk." He looked at Wendy and said, "So even though this must have been incredibly traumatic for you, you need to understand that Mitch's presence very likely saved you from something truly terrible." Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.
In 2007, a movie came out that would quietly change the course of one young man's life. The film was called Into the Wild, and it was based on the true story of Christopher McCandless. Christopher was a bright kid who graduated from a top-tier university with honors. By all accounts, he had the world at his feet. He could have taken any number of high-paying jobs and settled into a comfortable life. But Christopher didn't want comfort. He wanted something more raw, more real. He wanted absolute freedom. So, in 1990, without a word to his worried parents, he made a radical choice. He donated his entire life savings to charity, abandoned his car, shed his old identity, and set off for the Alaskan wilderness to live completely off the grid. He eventually found an abandoned city bus deep in the backcountry and made it his home. He survived out there for 113 days before tragically succumbing to starvation. While his story ends in tragedy, the movie focuses less on his death and more on his incredible spirit and his unwavering quest for a life of purpose and adventure. It leaves you feeling not so much sad, but inspired. Inspired to take risks, to seek out your own adventures before it's too late. One person who was deeply moved by this story was an 18-year-old from Oregon named Matt Higgins. Matt was just about to graduate from high school, and like a lot of kids his age, he was at a crossroads. He didn't have a clear plan. The paths of college or getting a full-time job didn't feel quite right to him yet. He felt like he needed something else first, some kind of experience that would help him figure out who he was. After seeing Into the Wild, a third option crystallized in his mind. He would have his own wilderness adventure, just like Christopher McCandless. But this wouldn't be a permanent departure from society. For Matt, it was a chance to hit the pause button on real life, to challenge himself, to go out and find himself in the quiet solitude of nature. And then, once he'd done that, he could come back and figure out the rest of his life. His plan was ambitious. After graduating in 2007, he would spend the winter saving up and preparing. Then, in the spring of 2008, he would embark on a solo journey to hike the entire California section of the Pacific Crest Trail, or the PCT. This was no small undertaking. The California section of the PCT is a formidable beast, stretching roughly 1,700 miles from the border of Mexico all the way north to the border of Oregon. The trail is a study in contrasts. It winds through scorching deserts, climbs over snow-capped mountains, and cuts through some of the most remote and dense forests in the country. There's dangerous wildlife to contend with, from rattlesnakes to mountain lions to black bears. And maybe most significantly, there are long stretches of the trail where a hiker is completely isolated, miles and miles away from the nearest road or town. If you get into trouble out there, you are well and truly on your own. It was not a hike for beginners. But Matt wasn't a beginner. He had spent his entire childhood exploring the outdoors. He grew up hiking and camping all over Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. He was just as comfortable on a well-marked state park trail as he was navigating the rugged, unmarked backcountry where you had to be constantly aware of your surroundings. He knew how to read a map and compass, how to pack for long treks, how to handle bad weather, and how to stay calm in a crisis. He felt that his years of experience made him perfectly suited for a challenge of this magnitude. And in many ways, he was right. He was prepared for the physical exhaustion, the harsh weather, and the dangers posed by Mother Nature. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what was actually waiting for him out there in the wilderness. After his high school graduation in 2007, Matt stuck to his plan. He worked and saved money, meticulously planned his route, and gathered all the necessary gear. In the spring of 2008, he said goodbye to his family, took a flight down to Southern California, and made his way to the dusty, sun-baked border of Mexico. There, at the southern terminus of the Pacific Crest Trail, he took his first steps north. His great adventure had begun. For the first few weeks, the hike was everything he had hoped it would be. He fell into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, eat a quick breakfast, pack up his camp, and hike. He'd walk all day, pushing his body to its limits, feeling the satisfying burn in his legs as he ticked off the miles. The scenery was breathtaking, changing every day from arid desert landscapes to lush green valleys. At night, when he was too tired to go any further or when the light began to fade, he would find a suitable spot just off the trail, set up his small one-man tent, cook a simple meal, and crawl into his sleeping bag. The silence of the wilderness was absolute, and he would fall asleep almost instantly, exhausted but deeply content. The next morning, he would wake up and do it all over again. During this initial part of his journey, the challenges he faced were the kind you'd expect on a long-distance hike. There was the constant battle against fatigue. There was one particularly hot stretch in the desert where he got a bit dehydrated and had to rest for a day to recover. Another time, he was walking along and almost stepped right on a coiled rattlesnake that was sunning itself on the trail. He jumped back just in time, his heart pounding in his chest, and waited for the snake to slither away. But aside from those minor incidents, the hike was going smoothly. By his standards, it was almost routine. He felt strong, capable, and completely in his element. But that feeling of routine and control was about to be shattered. When Matt reached the Lassen National Forest in Northern California, about 150 miles from his finish line at the Oregon border, his journey would take a dark and terrifying turn. Lassen National Forest is a vast, dense wilderness. Shortly after entering it, the trail changed dramatically. Matt found himself on a narrow, winding dirt path flanked on both sides by a thick wall of trees. The pines and firs grew so close together and so tall that they formed a canopy high above, blocking out much of the sunlight. It was like walking through a green tunnel. The dense forest muffled all sound, creating a deep, profound quiet. All Matt could hear was the gentle chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, and the soft crunch of his own boots on the dirt. It was peaceful, almost meditative. He was in no particular rush, just soaking in the solitude and the beauty of his surroundings. At some point, the trail took a sharp right turn. As Matt rounded the bend, he looked up and stopped for a second, a little startled. About 20 feet ahead, just off the right side of the path, there was a large boulder. And sitting on that boulder were two people, a man and a woman, probably middle-aged. The first thing Matt noticed was that they were both dressed entirely in white. Their clothes were dirty and stained as if they'd been wearing them for a very long time. The man had a long, wild, unkempt beard. The woman's hair was matted. But it wasn't their appearance that was so unsettling. It was the way they were looking at him. They were both just sitting there, perfectly still, staring at him with an intense, unblinking gaze. There was no expression on their faces. Not curiosity, not friendliness, not hostility. Just a blank, piercing stare. Feeling a bit awkward, Matt immediately dropped his gaze to the ground and kept walking. As he got closer, he decided he should at least be friendly. He looked back up, gave them a small, slightly uncomfortable smile and a little wave, and said, "Hi." They didn't respond. They didn't smile back. They didn't wave. They didn't even nod. They just continued to stare at him with those same empty eyes as he walked right past them. A wave of unease washed over Matt. He could feel their eyes on his back as he continued down the trail. He had the powerful, prickly sensation of being watched, and he fought the urge to turn around and look back at them. He just kept walking, his mind racing. Why were they so strange? Why wouldn't they even acknowledge him? That was the thing that really bothered him. On a trail as remote as the PCT, there's an unwritten code among hikers. You can go for days without seeing another soul. So when you do cross paths with someone, you always acknowledge them. A hello, a nod, a simple wave. It's a way of checking in, of confirming that you're both okay out there in the middle of nowhere. In fact, Matt hadn't seen another person for the last 2 days. These two were the first. And their complete lack of response felt wrong. It felt unnatural. But he tried to rationalize it. He told himself he didn't know their story. Maybe they were having a bad day. Maybe they were foreign tourists and didn't speak English. Who knew? It was none of his business, he decided. He put them out of his mind and just kept walking, never once looking back. A few hours later, the sun began to set, and the already dim light inside the forest tunnel started to fade fast. It was time to make camp. But the trees were still packed so tightly against the edges of the trail that there was no space to set up a tent without blocking the path. Matt didn't want to be an obstruction for any other potential hikers, so he decided to head off trail. He stepped off the path and began pushing his way through the dense undergrowth deeper into the forest. After walking for what he estimated was about 300 feet, the trees finally opened up into a small, secluded clearing. It was the perfect spot. He quickly set up his tent, then got out his small camp stove and cooked himself some dinner. When he was finished eating, he carefully packed all of his remaining food into a waterproof bag. He sealed it tightly, tied a long piece of cord to it, and then tossed the cord up and over a high branch on a nearby tree. He hoisted the bag up until it was dangling at least 15 feet off the ground, then tied off the other end of the cord to the tree trunk. This was standard procedure in bear country. It kept his food safe from any curious animals during the night. With his camp secured and the last of the daylight gone, it was now completely pitch black. Matt crawled into his tent, zipped up the door, wriggled into his sleeping bag, and was asleep in minutes. The next morning, Matt woke up just as the first hints of dawn were breaking. It was still quite dark, but there was just enough gray light filtering through the trees for him to see. He unzipped his tent flap and peeked outside. The first thing he noticed was that his food bag was gone. The cord was still hanging from the tree branch, but it had been cut, and the bag itself was nowhere to be seen. His initial thought was a bear. He figured a clever black bear must have come into his camp during the night, somehow managed to get the bag down, and then ran off with it. He sighed, annoyed at the loss of his food, but also a little impressed by the bear's ingenuity. He climbed out of his tent and started walking over to the tree, scanning the ground for bear tracks to confirm his theory. He got to the base of the tree and looked down. He didn't see any bear prints in the soft dirt, but he did see something else. He saw two distinct sets of human boot prints, and neither of them matched his own. Before he could even fully process what that meant, his eyes followed the tracks away from the tree, and his blood ran cold. The boot prints weren't just under the tree. He looked around the clearing and saw that they were everywhere. They led right up to the flap of his tent. They circled his tent. They crisscrossed all over his small campsite. As Matt stood there, staring at this disturbing network of footprints, his mind struggled to make sense of it. How was this possible? He had gone to sleep when it was already pitch black. He woke up when it was still dark. This meant that two people had somehow managed to find his campsite, which was 300 feet off the main trail in the middle of a dense, unmarked forest. And they had done it in the dead of night in total darkness without making a single sound that would have woken him up. How could anyone do that? And then it hit him. The people on the rock. The man and woman in white. It had to be them. They must have seen him, followed him at a distance, watched where he left the trail to make camp, and then waited until he was asleep to sneak in and rob him. The thought that they had been watching him all that time, standing silently in the darkness just feet away from where he slept, sent a shiver down his spine. And then a new, more urgent thought entered his mind. What if they were still here? What if they were watching him right now? He suddenly felt incredibly exposed. He whipped his head around, his eyes darting from tree to tree, half expecting to see their pale figures peering out at him from behind a trunk. He saw nothing. But that prickly feeling of being watched was back, and it was stronger than ever. Panic began to set in. He abandoned any thought of making breakfast. He just needed to get out of there. As quickly and quietly as he could, he stuffed his sleeping bag into his pack, took down his tent, and packed up the rest of his gear. Every little sound he made seemed to echo in the silent forest. He kept his movements calm and deliberate, trying not to show his fear, all the while thinking that at any moment they were going to emerge from the trees, or worse, grab him from behind. He shouldered his pack, which felt much lighter without his food, and started walking as fast as he could back in the direction of the trail. The 300-foot walk back felt like a mile. Finally, he broke through the last line of trees and was back on the narrow dirt path. He looked up and down the trail. It was empty. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm his racing heart. They were gone. He was safe, for now. He turned north and started walking, much faster than before. For the next several hours, Matt walked with a new sense of urgency. Every few minutes, he would glance over his shoulder, still half expecting to see the man and woman in white following him. But the trail behind him always remained empty. Eventually, the dense, claustrophobic forest began to thin out, and the narrow path opened up into a wide, beautiful meadow. The sun was high in the sky now, and its warm rays felt reassuring on his skin. In the open field, he could see for a great distance in every direction. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. Being out of the dark woods helped to ease his paranoia. And as he walked, he started to rationalize what had happened. Okay, he thought, it was incredibly creepy that those people followed him and snuck into his camp in the middle of the night. That was undeniable. But maybe their motives were simple. They were dressed in dirty clothes and looked disheveled. They were probably just desperately hungry. They clearly needed the food more than he did. And all they did was take the food. They didn't try to hurt him. They didn't even touch his tent. So, you know what? They could have the food. It was a scary experience, but it was over. He had left their territory, and he would never have to see or deal with the people in white ever again. He was wrong. Over the next 3 days, Matt continued his trek north through the Lawson Forest. The trail would alternate between those big open meadows and the dense dark sections of forest. During those 3 days, he saw no sign of the strange couple. No one bothered his campsites at night. Nothing else was stolen. This only reinforced his belief that the food theft had been a one-time incident, a crime of opportunity. They had gotten what they wanted, and they had moved on. He was starting to feel like himself again. But on the 4th day after the incident, the terror would return, and it would be far worse than before. On that 4th night, the trail led him deep into another one of those heavily forested areas. Just like before, when it came time to make camp, he was forced to venture off the trail to find a clearing. He walked several hundred feet into the woods, found a suitable spot, and set up his tent. But this time, he took an extra precaution. After what had happened before, he had developed a new routine. He walked around the entire perimeter of his campsite, gathering dry sticks and twigs. He then carefully laid them out on the ground in a wide circle around his tent. It was a makeshift early warning system. If any person or large animal got too close to his camp during the night, they would have to step on one of the sticks. The snap of the breaking wood would hopefully be loud enough to wake him up. With his campsite and his alarm system in place, Matt ate a quick dinner, secured his new supply of food high up in a tree, and then crawled into his tent. He was still on edge, but he felt a little safer with his stick perimeter. He eventually fell asleep. A few hours later, in the dead of night, Matt's eyes snapped open. He was instantly awake. He lay perfectly still in the absolute total blackness of his tent, straining his ears. He didn't know what had woken him. Maybe it was a noise, maybe it was just a feeling. He held his breath, listening to the silence of the forest. And then he heard it. It was a sharp, distinct cracking sound. The sound of a dry stick being snapped in half. Someone or something had just stepped on his perimeter. His heart immediately started hammering against his rib. An animal? Or a person? He didn't know, but he knew something was just a few feet away from him in the darkness. Instinct took over. As slowly and silently as he could, he slid his arm out of his sleeping bag. His hand fumbled in the dark for the familiar handle of his large hunting knife that he now kept right next to him. As his fingers wrapped around the handle, he heard more sounds. Footsteps. Whoever was out there wasn't being stealthy anymore. They hadn't been startled by the sound of the breaking stick. They were still moving, and they were moving directly towards his tent. Matt's mind replayed the image of the boot prints circling his tent a few nights ago. He was almost certain this wasn't an animal. It was them. The people in white were back. He clutched the knife tightly, his knuckles white. He was in the middle of nowhere, completely alone. If these people meant him harm, no one would hear him scream. He prepared himself to slash out through the fabric of the tent if he had to. The footsteps grew closer and closer until they stopped. They stopped right next to the side of the tent where his head was laying. They were maybe a foot away from him. He could almost feel their presence through the thin nylon wall. He was frozen, listening, waiting for what would happen next. And then he started to hear whispering. But it was strange. The whispering wasn't just coming from the person standing right next to his tent. It seemed to be coming from all around him, from different directions out in the forest. It was a low, frantic murmur, and he couldn't make out any words. As the disembodied whispering grew more agitated, the person right outside his tent began to move again. They started walking in a slow, deliberate circle around his tent. So now he was lying there in the dark, listening to footsteps circling him and frantic whispers coming from all directions. The sheer strangeness and terror of the situation was overwhelming. He was so petrified he couldn't move. The knife in his hand felt useless. He was just a terrified kid trapped in a thin nylon box surrounded by what? He had no idea. Then, just as suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. The footsteps ceased. The whispering went silent. The forest was plunged back into a dead, heavy silence. In a way, it was a relief. But in another, more terrifying way, it wasn't. Because he hadn't heard the sound of footsteps retreating. He hadn't heard them walk away back into the forest. It was as if one moment they were right there, circling him, and the next they had simply vanished. Or, and this was the thought that truly horrified him, they were still out there. Still surrounding his tent, but now they were just standing there. Motionless. Silent. Waiting. Waiting for him to do something. Waiting for him to come out. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, paralyzed by fear, wondering how many people were standing just outside his tent. 1? 2? 5? 10? There was no way to know. He didn't dare make a sound. He didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. He just waited for the sun to come up. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the fabric of his tent, he still hadn't heard any sounds of them leaving. For all he knew, they were still standing there, waiting for him. He knew he couldn't stay in the tent forever. He had to look. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the zipper, pulled it down in one quick loud motion, and threw the tent flap open, his knife held out in front of him. He looked outside. There was no one there. He scrambled out of the tent, ready to confront anyone he saw, but the clearing was empty. He scanned the tree line, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, any flash of white. Nothing. But was he really alone? Or were they just hiding, watching him from a few feet away behind the trees? He started to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. Was it all just a vivid, terrifying nightmare? But then he looked down at the ground. And there they were. Clear boot prints all over his campsite, including a perfectly worn circle in the dirt all the way around his tent. It had been real. All of it. That was it. He was done. He didn't even bother to pack neatly. He just shoved everything into his backpack as fast as he could, threw it over his shoulder, and started running. He crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at his face, not caring about the noise, just running back towards the trail. When he reached the path, he didn't slow down. He just kept running north. As he ran, looking back over his shoulder every few seconds, he had one thought repeating in his head: get out of Lassen National Forest. He told himself that this was their territory. If he could just get out of this forest, get away from their turf, they would leave him alone. This thought fueled him, and he ran and fast-hiked for the rest of the day. By late afternoon, he had finally made it out of the forest. He emerged from the tree line and found himself on the outskirts of a small town that bordered the park. That night, he set up his camp as close to the town as he could, wanting the comforting lights and sounds of civilization nearby. As he lay in his tent that night, unable to sleep, he replayed the events of the last few days over and over in his mind. He was now convinced that the man and woman in white were behind everything. The first encounter, where they stole his food, was creepy, but it made a twisted kind of sense. They were hungry. But the second encounter, the one from the previous night, made no sense at all. Assuming it was them, it meant they had been following him for days completely unseen. Even though he had been constantly looking over his shoulder for them, they had managed to shadow him without him ever spotting them. How was that possible? And then, how had they found his campsite again, another random spot hundreds of feet off the trail? And once they were there, what were they doing? What was the point of circling his tent and whispering? It wasn't to steal anything. It felt more like they were trying to terrorize him. And how did they just disappear into thin air without making a sound? None of it added up. It was all a terrifying, illogical nightmare. The next morning, as he packed up his camp, he seriously considered quitting the hike. He could just call his family, tell them to come pick him up, and go home. It was the safe, sane thing to do. But this hike meant so much to him. He was only about 100 miles from the finish line. He had already come over 1,600 miles. He had poured so much of himself into this journey, and he couldn't stand the thought of giving up now, so close to the end. He wanted to finish what he started. So, he made a decision. He would keep going. He shouldered his pack and continued north, leaving the small town behind and heading towards his next challenge, the Mount Shasta National Forest. Mount Shasta was in many ways similar to Lassen. It was another vast, dense wilderness. But Mount Shasta carried with it a much more sinister reputation. For decades, it has been a hotspot for strange and baffling disappearances. An unusually high number of people have vanished without a trace within the forest. Some of the most frightening stories come from people who were with someone who disappeared. They'll say that their friend or family member was walking right in front of them, they turned their back for just a moment, and when they looked again, the person was gone. Just gone. No tracks, no sound, no sign of a struggle, as if they were erased from existence. Despite massive search efforts, many of these people are never seen again. Knowing this, Matt entered the Mount Shasta forest with a deep sense of dread. He was once again on a narrow trail surrounded by a thick wall of trees. Every shadow looked like a person. Every snap of a twig made him jump. He felt like he was being watched again, and he just kept his head down, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, telling himself he was almost done. For the first 3 days in Mount Shasta, nothing happened. He hiked as far as he could each day, set up his camp, and spent the night undisturbed. He didn't see the people in white, or anyone else for that matter. A part of him started to hope that he had finally left them behind. But on the 4th day, that hope was extinguished. On that 4th day, the trail took him out of the dense woods and up onto the side of a mountain. At this higher elevation, the trees were much sparser. The visibility was incredible. He could see the trail snaking for miles ahead of him, and when he turned around, he could see it stretching for miles behind him. It was a beautiful, clear day. He was just walking along, enjoying the view, when at some point he casually turned to look back down the trail. He had been doing this all day, and it had always been empty. But this time, it wasn't. Miles and miles back, so far away that they were just tiny specks, he saw 2 little white dots. And they were slowly moving along the trail, heading in his direction. It was them. The people in white were back. He was now at least 50 miles, probably more, from where he had first seen them sitting on that boulder in Lassen. This confirmed his worst fears. They hadn't just stumbled upon him twice by chance. They had been actively, relentlessly stalking him this whole time, and for some unknown, terrifying reason, they were still following him. In that moment, finishing his hike meant nothing to him. All he wanted was to get away from these people. He ripped his map out of his pack, his hands shaking. He needed to find the nearest town, the nearest road, anything. To his horror, he realized he was in one of the most remote sections of the entire trail. The nearest town, a small place called Castella, was at least 25 miles away. He didn't have a better option. He shoved the map back into his pocket, took one last look at the two white dots that were steadily getting closer, and then he turned and ran. He ran for hours, not daring to stop. He didn't even look back anymore. He just ran. When the sun started to set and the trail became harder to see, he kept running. It wasn't until it was so dark that he literally could not see his own feet that he finally, totally exhausted, stumbled to a stop. He immediately left the trail, pushing his way deep into the forest, much further than ever before, trying to get as far away from the path as he possibly could. He eventually found a small clearing hundreds of feet from the trail. He set up his tent in the middle of it, and then, with painstaking diligence, he laid out his perimeter of sticks, making it thicker and wider than ever before. He crawled into his tent, but he didn't take off his boots or his clothes. He wanted to be ready to run at a moment's notice. He lay there in his sleeping bag, his knife in his hand, terrified, with no expectation of getting any sleep. He tried to calm himself. He had run for miles. There was no way they could have kept up. There was no way they saw where he left the trail. They couldn't possibly find him here. He lay there for hours in the silent darkness. Eventually, sheer exhaustion began to take over. His eyes felt heavy. He started to drift off. And just as he was about to fall asleep, he heard it. The snap of a stick from his perimeter. Before he could even react, the whispering started again, all around him. And then, something new happened. His entire tent was suddenly illuminated with a blindingly bright light. Someone was shining a powerful flashlight or a lantern directly on his tent, lighting it up like a paper lantern. They had found him again. In the middle of the night, in a random spot hundreds of feet off the trail, they had found him. And now they were shining a light on him, letting him know they were there. Then the light clicked off, plunging him back into terrifying silence and darkness. That was the breaking point. His survival instinct took over. He wasn't going to just lie there and wait. He ripped himself out of his sleeping bag, burst out of his tent, screaming at the top of his lungs, waving his knife wildly in the air. He was screaming nonsense, just trying to make noise, trying to be big and threatening, hoping to scare them away. After a few seconds, he stopped, breathing heavily, listening. He heard a crunch of leaves right behind him. He spun around to see who was there, and as he turned, he caught a glimpse of a dark figure moving towards him fast out of the corner of his eye. He didn't think. He just ran. He sprinted away from his campsite, away from the figure, deeper into the pitch-black forest. He was running blind, crashing into trees, getting slapped in the face by low-hanging branches. He tripped and fell, scrambled back to his feet, and kept running, powered by pure adrenaline. He didn't know if he was being chased, but he wasn't going to stop to find out. After about 5 minutes of this frantic, blind sprint, his foot caught on a root and he went tumbling forward. He landed hard at the base of a large fallen tree. The tree had come to rest on a rock, creating a small, dark gap underneath the massive trunk. Without a second's hesitation, Matt wriggled himself into the gap, pulling himself under the log until he was completely hidden. He positioned himself so he could peer back in the direction he had come from. He lay there, his heart pounding, trying to control his breathing, and then he saw it. In the distance, a bobbing circle of light. It was their flashlight. They were looking for him. They were actively hunting him in the woods. He watched in absolute horror from his hiding spot as the light moved through the trees, getting closer and closer and closer. It swept back and forth across the forest floor. At one point, the beam of light passed right over his hiding spot, just inches from his face. But they didn't see him. The light kept moving, and eventually it passed by his position and continued on deeper into the forest. Matt stayed under that log for the rest of the night. He didn't move a muscle. Even when the sun came up and it was obvious that whoever was looking for him was long gone, he was still too terrified to move. He remained hidden under that log for hours, well into the early afternoon. Finally, he summoned the courage to pull himself out. He looked around. The forest was quiet. He was alone. His campsite, with all of his expensive gear, his journal, and his personal belongings, was somewhere back there in the woods. But there was no way he was going back for it. He was worried they might still be there, waiting for him. He abandoned everything. He turned and started running again, away from his campsite, back towards where he thought the trail was. When he finally found the trail, he didn't stop. He ran and walked the remaining miles all the way to the town of Castella. When he got there, a kind driver gave him a ride to the nearby town of Mount Shasta. The first thing he did was go to the police. He told them and the Forestry Service everything that had happened. They took down his report, and seeing how shaken he was, they put him up in a local motel for the night. The next day, Matt called his family. They immediately got in their car and drove down from Oregon to pick him up and take him home. His great adventure was over. Months later, Matt called the Mount Shasta police and the Forest Service to follow up. He asked if they had ever found the people in white or if anyone else had reported similar experiences. The police told him that they had received a number of reports of food and gear being stolen from campsites in both Lassen and Mount Shasta forests around that time. But Matt was the only person who had reported being actively stalked and terrorized by a mysterious couple dressed in white. To this day, Matt has no idea who those two people were or what they really wanted from him. After they stole his food, their motives seemed to change. They followed him for nearly 100 miles, somehow finding his hidden campsites in the dead of night for no other apparent reason than to torment him. How they moved so silently and how they found him time and time again in the vast wilderness remains a complete and terrifying mystery. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 1988, a waitress living in Central Florida had just started her shift at a local diner. She was standing in the middle of the restaurant, getting ready to take an order, when her heart just started racing like crazy. Now, she hadn't been running around or doing any heavy lifting, so it didn't make any sense at all. Startled by what was happening inside her own chest, she just turned around, walked straight into the staff bathroom, and sat down in a stall. She just wanted to wait for this strange sensation to pass. But as she sat there, her heart just continued to beat like a drum, faster and faster. And then she began to feel a strange tingling sensation in her feet, which started to crawl up into her arms. And it was at that moment that a terrifying thought crossed her mind. She realized she might be having a heart attack. Except she wasn't. Something much, much worse was happening to her. Peggy Carr's life had never been particularly easy. She was born back in 1947 in a very small rural town in Central Florida. Her parents were both deaf and had almost no money, so from a very young age, Peggy had to go to work to help support the family. But the only jobs she could find were either extremely low paying or they were just outright dangerous. She worked overnight shifts at isolated truck stops on deserted highways, often waitressing there all by herself. But Peggy never once complained about her job prospects. She just took whatever work was available because she knew her family needed the money. And whenever she was working in one of those dangerous environments, she would intentionally put on this very tough exterior. She did it to make sure no one would even think about trying to take advantage of her. And despite her small stature, she quickly developed a reputation among her coworkers as somebody you did not want to mess with. Peggy didn't take any nonsense from anybody. But while this kind of prickly outer shell protected her from potential predators, it also had a way of warding off potential romantic partners. A lot of men might have been interested in her, but they were kind of intimidated when they tried to talk to her. Eventually, one man did manage to cut through Peggy's defenses. They fell in love, got married, and they had 3 kids together. And for a while, everything was great. Until it wasn't. The marriage eventually crashed and burned, and so by the mid-1980s, Peggy was in her mid-30s, a divorced mother of 3 teenage children, and she was working overtime at a local diner just to barely make ends meet. And while she still acted very tough and composed when she was at work or out in public, when she was behind closed doors at home with her kids, they saw the real Peggy. And that side of her was just kind of sad. Life had just been hard on her, and she had tried so hard to provide a safe and happy home for her kids, and she felt like she'd kind of let them down. But her kids, on the other hand, they weren't bitter towards their mother for the divorce. It just pained them to see her so upset all the time. And so her kids really hoped that one day their mom would meet somebody new, that she would fall in love all over again, and maybe that would finally put a smile back on her face. And in late 1987, that is exactly what happened. That year, Peggy met a man named Pi R. Carr. Pi, which was his nickname, was a lot like Peggy. He was a recently divorced single father of 2 teenage children. He didn't take nonsense from anyone, and just like Peggy, he had been forced to start working at a fairly young age. When Peggy met him, he was living with his 2 kids in another tiny Central Floridian rural town called Alturas. He was the foreman of a local phosphate mining company there. Phosphate is a chemical that has a lot of industrial and consumer uses. So Peggy and Pi, they started dating, and right away, Peggy's kids noticed this huge shift in their mother. I mean, now she was all smiles, she was so happy. It seemed like Pi was the knight in shining armor that had come to save the day. And then, just a couple of months later, in April of 1988, Pi and Peggy got married, much to their children's excitement. After the marriage was finalized, Peggy and her 3 kids moved in with Pi and his 2 kids in his home in Alturas, Florida. And for a while, this newly blended family worked out perfectly. Even though they were all living in a fairly small house and all 5 teenagers were kind of on top of each other, they all got along great. It was kind of fun and chaotic to have so many people in the house all the time. The house just felt like it was bursting with life. But within a few months of Peggy and her kids moving in, Peggy and Pi started to have serious marital issues. It was like all their early chemistry had just completely vanished. And in its place was nothing but resentment. They basically couldn't stand each other, and everything one of them did seemed to upset the other person. And then, adding fuel to the fire, were rumors that began spreading around this small town where everybody knows everybody else's business. The rumor was that Pi was apparently back together with an ex-girlfriend, and so he was having an affair. Pi denied these accusations, but Peggy totally believed them. And so their fights got worse and worse and worse. The more they fought, the more a wedge was driven down the center of this blended family. Peggy's kids automatically took their mother's side, and Pi's kids automatically took their dad's side. And so from the outside looking in, it seemed plainly obvious that Pi and Peggy's marriage was not going to last. But before their marriage could officially fall apart, something totally unexpected happened that would link these 2 families together forever. In late October of 1988, about 7 months into Peggy and Pi's now very rocky marriage, Pi suddenly got up one morning and just told Peggy he was leaving for the whole day to go hunting. This wasn't a planned trip. He just wanted to get away. And at this point, neither of them wanted to spend any time with each other, so Peggy didn't care. She just said, "Go ahead, enjoy your trip, I'll see you later." And so Pi, he leaves the house, gets in his truck, and drives off. A little while later, Peggy and her daughter Sissy, they both get their things together and head out. They get in Peggy's car and they drive into town. Both Peggy and her daughter worked at the same diner as waitresses, and they both had a shift that morning. So they arrive at the diner, they both get out, they go inside, get their aprons on, and they begin their shift like normal. But not long into the shift, Peggy was about to walk up to one of her tables when she noticed her heart was racing. And she had not been running around the restaurant, she had not done any heavy lifting. There was absolutely no reason for her heart to suddenly be beating at a really fast clip. Initially, Peggy just tried to ignore it. She thought maybe it was just a fluke, that her heart would slow down and she would go back to normal. But when her racing heart persisted, she walked away from the table she was waiting on and snuck off into the staff bathroom. She went into one of the stalls, she shut the door, and she just sat on the toilet waiting for her heart to stop racing. But as she sat there, not only did her heart continue to thump like mad, but she started to notice her legs were tingling and so were her arms. Now, Peggy was a no-nonsense person. She was not prone to panicking or overreacting or anything like that. So as she's sitting there feeling these strange symptoms, it dawns on her that maybe, just maybe, she was having a heart attack. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to deal with this. She stands up, she opens the stall door, she goes to the sink, she washes her hands, she splashes some cold water on her face. She kind of calms herself down, and then she walks out of the bathroom. She goes right into the staff break room and she finds her daughter. She tells her, I think I'm having a heart attack. But don't worry. I'm just going to go home. I'm going to lie down, and if this gets worse, I will go to the hospital. But for right now, I don't really know what it is, but I want to take it seriously. So I'm going to leave for the day. Her daughter, Sissy, is looking at her mom really concerned. But Sissy knows what her mom is like. Her mom is tough as nails. She is the type of person who would try to sleep off a heart attack. And so she says to her mom, okay, go home. I'll be sure to check on you as soon as I get back. And please call me if anything changes. And so Peggy, whose heart was still racing and whose arms and legs were still tingling, she told her daughter, everything's going to be fine. And then she told her manager that she was leaving for the day. Peggy slipped out the back door, she got in her car, and she drove back home. When she got there, the house was empty. So she just went inside, made her way to her bedroom, and she lay down in her bed to try to get some rest. That afternoon, Peggy's son, Dwayne, came home from high school. And when he walked inside, he found his mother laying down in her bed. This was very unusual for Dwayne. His mother never took naps. In fact, he could not recall a single time ever that he saw his mom napping, not even when she was sick. And so, concerned, he went into her bedroom. She was facing away from him, so he kind of gently jostled her awake. And when his mom rolled over to face him, her face was pale, she was sweating. She obviously had not been sleeping. She was gritting her teeth, and it looked like she was in a lot of pain or some sort of extreme discomfort. And he said, Mom, geez, are you okay? And she would say to him, oh no, I'm fine. I'm just sleeping something off. I got something going on, I think I have a flu or something, I don't know. I took off from work, so I'm just sleeping it off. And so Dwayne, he knows his mom is tough as nails. And if she says she's going to sleep something off, then she'll probably be just fine. So Dwayne said, okay, well, let me know if you need anything. And so Dwayne began to walk away. But his mother would actually call him back. And she would level with him. She would tell him that actually something is really wrong here. She said she felt like someone had poured fire down her veins, in her arms, and in her legs, and that it was excruciatingly painful. And so Dwayne is hearing his mother say this, and he knows his mother is not the type of person to complain or exaggerate or anything. She is just straight no nonsense. And so for her to say this is the most excruciating pain she's ever been in, and she's laying in bed unable to move, he knew this was really, really serious. So Dwayne began telling his mom that she had to go to the hospital. He said, "We need to get Pi here to drive you, or we need to call an ambulance, but something needs to be done here." But despite the pain she was in, Peggy was still a little bit hesitant about it. She thought maybe she could still just sleep it off. But as they're having this kind of back and forth about what to do, Pi returned from his hunting trip. He came into the house, and right away, Dwayne ran over to him. He explained to Pi, "Hey, this is not normal. My mom never, ever acts this way. She never complains. This is really serious. You gotta take her to the hospital." But Pi would actually say, "She's fine. I'm sure she just has a fever or maybe the flu. Man, she'll sleep it off." But when he walked into the bedroom and he saw his wife looking so horrible and literally squirming in pain, he relented and said, "Okay, I'll take her to the hospital." And so Pi would have to literally carry Peggy out of the house, put her in his truck, he drove her to the hospital, and then had to carry her into the hospital. And by the time Peggy was under a doctor's care, she could no longer talk. She was just moaning in agony from this excruciating pain in her limbs. Her heart was still racing, and she was nauseous, and she was vomiting. I mean, she was really spiraling, and quickly. And so after she was admitted, the doctors turned to Pi and to Dwayne and to Sissy and the other family members that had gathered, and they asked them, "Do you have any idea what could have caused this?" And they all said no. She just suddenly started feeling this way. So the doctors, who were unable to ask Peggy anything because she was in such blinding pain she couldn't even talk, they just began running her through a wide-ranging series of tests to try to figure out what was going on. But when these results began coming in, either she was negative for the thing they were testing for, or the tests just came back saying that everything was normal. So they're looking at Peggy, seeing her completely falling apart, yet none of their tests revealed anything was wrong with her. And so they were at a complete loss. They didn't know what was wrong with her. And so, without a better option, they just put Peggy into a hospital room and began monitoring her. And sure enough, after being in the hospital for 3 days, Peggy's symptoms started to come down. While she wasn't back completely to her old self, she was able to speak again, she was able to eat and drink water and move around. She was still very uncomfortable, her heart would still race periodically, and she would get fits of pain in all of her extremities, but overall, she felt like she was really improving. And so after 3 days, she was discharged from the hospital. Peggy and her family drove back to their home, and initially, everything was okay. It seemed like she was on the mend. But within 24 hours, Peggy's heart started to race again. And before long, her arms and legs felt like they were on fire all over again. Now, Peggy and her family, they knew that the doctors didn't know what this condition was, and so their immediate reaction was huge concern that Peggy was again suffering from this horrible thing. But going back to the hospital didn't really feel like the obvious first choice. In fact, the obvious first choice, at least for Peggy, was just to stay at the house and try to wait it out the same way she had waited it out at the hospital. But over the next several days, despite laying in bed and resting as much as she could, her symptoms did not get any better. They got worse and worse and worse. It got to the point where she was literally completely bedridden, and all she could do was just shake and periodically scream into her pillow from all the pain she was experiencing in her extremities. And so finally, on October 30th, which was 10 days from the first day that Peggy felt these strange symptoms at the diner, her family decided, you know what, enough is enough. She obviously is not able to just sleep off whatever this is. And so they called an ambulance, which rushed her to the hospital. And when she got there, the doctors, they remembered her from the week before. So they understood this was a bit of a mystery. But just in case, they ran the exact same battery of tests on her to see if maybe now there was some other indication of what this was. But again, all of the tests came back, and they either came back negative or inconclusive or just showed that nothing was physically wrong with her. The doctors even ran her through some tests for poison, thinking, maybe she accidentally ingested something toxic, and that's what was causing all of this. But those tests as well came back negative. And so, totally stumped, the doctors decided the only thing they could do was once again put her in a hospital room and just monitor her. And so that night, Peggy was wheeled into a room, and all night, up and down that hospital wing, people listened to the sound of Peggy screaming at the top of her lungs from the pain she was experiencing. And then, the next morning, the whole situation got even worse. Not only for Peggy, who by now was dipping in and out of consciousness, but also for the rest of her family. Because that morning, Peggy's son Dwayne and Peggy's stepson, so Pi's son Travis, they were both admitted to the same hospital for exhibiting the same symptoms as Peggy. Their hearts were racing, they were nauseous, they were vomiting, and their arms and legs were starting to tingle. And so the doctors, with nothing else to do, just ran Dwayne and Travis through all the same tests they had put Peggy through. And they all came back negative, or they came back normal. However, shortly after Dwayne and Travis had been admitted to the hospital, a neurologist who was looking after Peggy, he noticed something about her condition. And suddenly, it was like his medical training from back in college kicked in. He remembered something very specific that lined up exactly with what he was seeing in Peggy. And he suddenly realized that he knew what was going on. So he told his colleagues, and they ran out, and they got this very specialized testing kit that doctors very rarely use. It's only for this one really specific and very rare condition. And they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy. And sure enough, the next day, the results came back. And all three tested positive for this condition that the neurologist had guessed. And even though there was a cure for this condition, for Peggy, it was too late. Her body had been so completely ravaged that even if they administered the cure, it would not work fast enough to save her life. And so that day, the doctors went to Peggy, who, despite being on all these painkillers, was still squirming and writhing in pain and screaming into her pillow. They would tell her that she was going to die. The only thing they could do was try to make her as comfortable as possible and then try to save her boys. Not long after being told this terrible news, Peggy would slip into a coma. And then, 4 months later, on the 3rd of March 1989, Peggy's family had to make the heart-wrenching decision to pull her off life support. And at that point, she passed away. As for her two boys, Dwayne would remain hospitalized for 2 months and would make a full recovery. As for Travis, he would remain hospitalized for 6 months, and while he would recover, he would never walk normally again. Even though the actual medical condition that killed Peggy and nearly killed Dwayne and Travis was completely known at this point, everybody knew what it was. What nobody could figure out was why this happened. Why in the world did this happen to these people? It made no sense at all. However, shortly after Peggy's death, that mystery would actually begin to unravel in the most bizarre and totally roundabout way. There is an international organization called Mensa. It's not an acronym. It's a Latin word that roughly translates to table or mind. And this organization is a highly exclusive society for the ultra-intelligent. You literally have to prove that your IQ, which is an intelligence test, ranks in the top 2% of everybody in the entire world. And even then, you may not be smart enough to get in. And in the same town that Peggy and Pi had lived in, Alturas, Florida, there was a chapter of Mensa. And the way some of these chapters worked is they would just get together every month and do some sort of intellectually stimulating activity. And in Alturas, what that meant was the chapter would get together at some private location once a month, and they would put on what they called a murder mystery weekend. The members of this chapter would head off to some private location, like an inn or a hotel or a cabin or something, and they would all role-play a murder investigation. One or two of the Mensa members would come up with a very elaborate murder and a subsequent investigation, and they would assign different fake characters to each of the real Mensa members. So once they got there, they'd all find out what character they were and what they were responsible for. And then, once they got into character, which included dressing up in costumes, they would remain in character until the killer was revealed. So this activity was meant to be extremely intellectually challenging, but also it was extremely fun. The group loved these murder mystery weekends. And so with that in mind, just a couple of weeks after Peggy had passed away, so this is sometime in April of 1989, a new genius was accepted into the ranks of the Alturas Mensa chapter. Her name was Sherry Gwynn, and she was a middle-aged woman who had recently fled from Texas to Central Florida to get away from her abusive husband, who still lived in Texas. After she was accepted into the Mensa chapter, it became abundantly clear to the members that Sherry was eager to make friends. But not just any friends. She wanted to make friends with two very specific members of the Alturas Mensa chapter. And they were Diana Carr, who had no relationship to Pi Carr or his family, and Diana's husband, whose name was George Treppel. Diana was a very successful orthopedic surgeon who had her own practice in Alturas, Florida. And George was this computer programmer who had more advanced degrees than you could count. And critically, Diana and George just so happened to live right next door to Peggy and Pi's house. Even though Sherry came on really strong right away to try to become friends with Diana and George, neither of them were fazed. The couple just figured, here's a woman who's living by herself, she's moved to a brand new area, she's run away from an abusive husband. It's no wonder she wants friends. She probably just needs some support. And so Diana and George were happy to just become her friend. The same month that Sherry was accepted into the Alturas Mensa chapter, George and Diana happened to be chosen as the people responsible for coming up with the complicated scenario that the group would act out during their murder mystery weekend that month. So George and Diana very diligently sat down and went over how to make the case as complicated as they could. And George took on the responsibility of really focusing on exactly how the victim in their fake scenario would be killed, because he was really trying to make it as difficult as he possibly could. He was trying to find the perfect murder that would be nearly impossible to solve. And so he came up with this very elaborate murder scene, and then between him and what his wife was creating, they put together this really intense and very complicated scenario that they were both very happy about. And so, a couple of days later, it was time to head out for the murder mystery weekend that George and Diana had worked so hard on. And so they went and printed off a whole bunch of those cards that would have all the information about who each of the Mensa members were going to be in this role-playing game. And there was some initial information about the murder that was committed, the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with. And so they printed all those cards out, they grabbed their costumes, they packed their stuff up, they hopped in the car, and they drove to the nearby inn where they met up with the rest of the Mensa members, which included Sherry. So they get to this inn, everybody checks in, and then afterwards, they all meet up in the lobby where George and Diana hand out their cards that have the information about the role-playing game. And so everybody's reading it and figuring out what they're going to do with their character. And everyone's also looking at the so-called perfect crime that George had come up with that he was also very proud about. And he was kind of boasting to the audience about how difficult this weekend was going to be. He really came up with the perfect crime. And so as all the members are reading their cards, Sherry would see the murder weapon used in this game, and she would become fascinated with it. She would make a point of going over to George and asking him lots and lots of questions about how he came up with this particular choice of a murder weapon and what actually happens when this is used on a person, not just in the game, but in real life. It was like Sherry had become obsessed with this exact form of murder. She was so interested in it. And George, he was immediately aware that Sherry was kind of unnaturally interested in exactly how he had come up with the scheme. But in a way, it was kind of flattering for George, because he had spent a lot of time constructing it to make it as complicated as he could. And so he indulged Sherry, and he sat there and told her everything about this particular weapon and what it does to the human body and, how you can get it and what the history of this weapon was. And the whole time, Sherry is just totally locked in. I mean, she's really focused on this particular style of murder. So that murder mystery weekend would eventually come to an end, and all the Mensa members would think it was great, and they would head home. And then, over the course of nearly a year after that, Sherry would be a near constant in George and Diana's lives. I mean, she was always around them. She always wanted to meet up with them. She was always talking to them and asking them questions and calling. And anytime she was with them, she always wanted to be with George. And when she was with George, a lot of times she would bring up that very particular murder method that he had come up with for the murder mystery weekend. And George just continued to think this was just the greatest thing. It was so flattering that she thought he was so smart that he had come up with the perfect crime. And so anytime she wanted to talk about it, he would just indulge her because it made him feel really good. And if George and Diana had seen any red flags in Sherry with her behavior towards them, they certainly didn't show it. They basically were operating under the assumption that Sherry, no matter what, was just this helpless, harmless person who had come to Central Florida, and she was trying to be their friend, and so they should try to be her friend back. But, as they would soon find out, they were very, very wrong about Sherry. In December of 1989, so roughly 8 months after George and Diana had first met Sherry, Diana decided she wanted to move her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring. And the drive from where their house was in Alturas to where her new office was going to be was just far enough that it made sense for George and Diana to relocate to Sebring. And when Sherry discovered that the couple was moving, she immediately called George and said, "Please let me rent out your house. I don't have a place to stay. I've been staying with friends. I'll pay whatever rent you want." And as it happened, George and Diana had actually talked about keeping the house and renting it out. And so it was actually a pretty easy decision. They trusted Sherry. And so they said, you know what? That's fine. You can rent out the house for a couple of months, and then we'll decide if this is a long-term solution or not. And within just a couple of hours, Sherry was on Diana and George's doorstep with a sleeping bag and a small bag of toiletries ready to go inside. And so George and Diana, they grabbed the last couple of things they needed, and then as they walked out the front door, they gave their house key to Sherry and told her, hey, if you need anything, just give us a call. And then George and Diana, they climbed into their car. And as soon as they had driven off and were out of view, Sherry dropped her things, she kind of looked around, and then she ran inside of the house. And just minutes later, practically the entire Alturas Police Department came crashing through that front door after Sherry. And within an hour, the police department would find something that would not only reveal the true identity of Sherry and her true intentions, but it would also reveal the truth about what happened to Peggy and her family. A couple of days before Peggy first started feeling bad, when her heart started racing and her arms and legs began tingling at the diner, a couple of days before that, someone had placed 8 Coca-Cola bottles, so full sodas, glass bottles, inside of Peggy and Pi's kitchen. And they set these 8 drinks kind of tucked away inside of a storage nook. A couple of days later, the family discovered these sodas, but they didn't think anything of it. They just figured somebody else in the family had bought them and left them in the kitchen, and so they were fair game. So before long, Peggy and the rest of her family were drinking these Cokes. But Peggy, who was notorious for loving Coca-Cola, drank way more than anybody else. Well, it would turn out all 8 of those Coca-Colas had been tampered with. They all contained a significant dose of the heavy metal called thallium. Thallium is odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless, and even though there are very small trace amounts that naturally occur inside of our bodies, if there's even a little bit more than that inside of our bloodstream, it becomes lethal. And so when Peggy was admitted to the hospital the second time around, the same time that Dwayne and Travis were also admitted, that neurologist who was looking at Peggy, what he noticed about her condition was that her hair was starting to fall out. And that's when it clicked for him. He had this flashback to his medical training where he was taught about thallium poisoning, and one of the key symptoms was hair loss. The other symptom was extreme pain in the extremities. And so the neurologist and his colleagues went and got a thallium test kit, and they tested Dwayne and Travis and Peggy, and they all came back positive for thallium poisoning. But the level of thallium inside of them was astronomical. The boys were lucky to have survived. They had 20,000 times the amount that naturally occurs inside of the human body. As for Peggy, she had an astounding 50,000 times the amount that naturally occurs, way more than was lethal. And so that was why the doctors told her, there's nothing we can do, your body is basically already dead, you're just technically still alive right now. And so the rest of the family, besides Dwayne and Travis, would also test for thallium, and they would all, with the exception of one child, have elevated levels of thallium. However, compared to Dwayne, Travis, and Peggy, of course, their conditions were negligible and they would all make full recoveries. And so the doctors realized fairly early on that this family had been poisoned. And so they contacted the police, who launched an investigation. And right away, their primary suspect was Pi. He and Peggy had been fighting extensively before she fell ill. He also had that kind of abrupt hunting trip that lined up with the day Peggy started feeling sick. And so they're thinking, okay, well, did that have something to do with how he planted the thallium? And then also, there was the fact that Pi worked at the phosphate mining company and so had access to fairly rare chemicals. However, upon closer inspection, Pi did not have access to thallium specifically. Thallium is incredibly rare and very expensive. And it just seemed odd that he would use thallium to poison and kill his wife, but he would also poison himself and his son, who he adored. It just didn't really add up. And so Pi would get ruled out as a suspect fairly quickly. But during one of his last interrogations, he would give the police something he didn't think was very valuable, but it wound up being very significant. He would say that 3 months before Peggy got sick, their family received a death threat. He opened the mail one day, and there was this typed out note that said their family needed to leave Florida in the next 2 weeks or they were all going to die. But Pi thought it was some stupid teenage prank, and so he didn't think anything of it. And then when 2 weeks went by and they weren't dead, he just kind of forgot about it. And so after the police had ruled Pi out as a suspect, they didn't know where to turn. They had no other suspects. And so they just began focusing on who might have written this note. And that's where Sherry comes in. Sherry Gwynn was not a Texas transplant who had come to Central Florida to run away from her abusive husband. Sherry Gwynn wasn't even her real name. Her real name was Susan Gorick, and she had lived in Central Florida for most of her life. Susan was very smart, but she certainly was not Mensa-level genius smart. And so almost certainly her paperwork that got her into the Alturas Mensa chapter was forged. Susan also had absolutely no interest in becoming real friends with Diana and George. The only reason she was pretending to be their friend and wanting to be around them all the time is because she was studying them. Because Susan was actually an undercover police officer. She had been sent undercover after the police discovered Diana and George were responsible for that death threat letter that was sent to Peggy and Pi. It would turn out Diana and George hated Peggy, Pi, and their kids. They hated them. They thought they were obnoxious, they were too noisy, they were annoying. And so Diana, who for context was the type of person who would stop people mid-sentence and correct them if they ever referred to her as anything other than doctor. She had gotten into at least 1 or 2 serious yelling fights with Peggy and with Pi and their kids when she had gone over to tell them to turn their music down and be quiet and do this and do that. And Peggy and Pi, they're not putting up with that. They just told her to get out of here. As for George, he didn't get into any public altercations with Peggy and Pi and their family. George was a very meek and submissive guy. He was very meager, and he was mostly a recluse. But he spent virtually all day peering out the window at Peggy and Pi and their family, studying what they were doing and obsessing over how noisy and obnoxious they were. And as he's seeing his wife getting more and more frustrated with their neighbors, George finally decides he's going to take drastic action. And so that's when George types out that death threat and he sends it across the way. But after Pi reads it, nothing happens. They don't leave Florida within 2 weeks. And so George went to phase 2 of his plan. George had actually spent time in a federal prison in the 1970s for cooking meth, and one of the byproducts of making meth is thallium. So George used his old meth cooking skills, and he whipped up some thallium, and he put lethal doses of thallium in 8 different Coca-Cola bottles. And then after mixing them all up, so you couldn't tell there was any chemical inside of them, he used his bottle capping machine to put tops back on top of each of them. George made his own beer, and so that's why he had a capping machine at his house. And so, with his 8 deadly drinks all prepared, looking like brand new Coca-Colas, George waited until Peggy and Pi and her family were out of their house, and then he snuck over and he walked into their kitchen and he placed these Coca-Colas right down on a kitchen counter and he slid them into a storage nook, and then he left the house. And that was it. And over the next several weeks, he watched with absolute pleasure as the family got sick and then Peggy died. While George never actually admitted that he had poisoned his neighbors, he did do some things that really tipped off Susan that he had to be the guy. Like, for example, that Mensa mystery murder weekend. The murder method that George had come up with was poisoning. And remember, at that point, Susan has been sent undercover to find out if George and Diana are responsible for poisoning their neighbors. And now George is sitting up there talking about the perfect crime he's come up with, and it's poisoning. And so that was why she had followed up with him really specifically on, wow, what else do you know about poisoning, and how did you learn about poisoning, and what kind of poisons do you know about? And over the following months, even though Susan never got George to actually admit to her when she was undercover recording him that he was the poisoner, she did completely earn his trust. And she did this by always making sure she was very submissive around him and always made sure to stroke his ego and remind him how smart he was. I mean, George was used to being in a relationship with Diana, who was extremely overbearing and kind of kept him under her thumb. And so Susan kind of allowed George to feel like he was in control for once, and he loved it. And so he completely trusted Susan to the point where when he and Diana were going to move out of Alturas, they were willing to rent their house to Susan. And this is important because the house had not actually been emptied. A lot of their things were still in the house, including George's things. And so he just assumed Susan would never go through his things. But as soon as Susan was in that house and she watched George and Diana drive off, she immediately called in backup. The police swarmed the house, they searched it top to bottom, and in the garage, they found George's chemistry equipment. And nestled underneath it was a bottle that contained thallium. George would be found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as attempted murder on the rest of Peggy's family, and he would be sentenced to death. As of this episode, he is still alive, and he is still on death row. As for his wife Diana, who many people believe must have had something to do with the poisoning, or must have at least known it was happening, was never actually charged with anything. And so she would eventually divorce George and move on with her life and remarry. Some cases end with answers. Others end with more questions than anyone can ever fully explain. If you enjoyed this episode, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget, you can find more true crime stories like this in the playlist waiting for you right now. See you in the next story.